Ah, there we go.
Forge! I'm still a hard man. Let's go! Awesome. Nice. The stream is going very smoothly. So, we're off to a good start so far. Off to a good start so far. How are you doing, Willie McDuff, in the chat? How are you all doing this evening? It is April 21st. It will soon be April the 22nd, and it will be well after midnight by the time I'm through with this. So, I am going to be doing a ForgeWarHammer review. I am your host, Imperator of Forge. Tonight I will be reviewing American Foreign Policy, Number 1, Beginnings, 1760 to 1845. So I will be starting with before the American Revolution, the American Revolutionary War, and I will be ending with the annexation of the Republic of Texas into the United States and the beginnings of the Mexican War, 1846 to 1848. The series will be over with before the Mexican War, so I will not be talking about that. We'll be talking about events like some of the French and Indian War, the Boston Tea Party and the Boston Massacre, and the events that led to the American Revolution. I will be talking a bit about the War of 1812, and we will be talking about various Indian wars. In fact, much of this will be about recognition of the right of trade on the seas and various Indian wars. Most of the battles and most of the incursions that the early American Republic had was actually with various Native American tribes in the various eastern regions of the United States, from Maine down to Georgia, and from basically New Jersey all the way out to, I guess, Ohio and Missouri, Ohio, Indiana, places like that. So, not the entire, what will become the United States, but kind of the eastern, everything east of the Mississippi River, I'll be talking about in these years. This is the very formal beginnings of this country, of this nation. It is now 250 years since the battles of Lexington and Concord. The British were marching out from Boston. They had occupied the port of Boston, Massachusetts, and they were going out to disarm some of the militiamen in Concord. On their way, they ran into a militia somewhere on Lexington Green. Paul Revere had already rode out and had warned the people of Lexington and Concord that the British are coming. The British are coming by land and by sea. At some point, some frustrated colonial militiamen fired the first volley, fired the first round, and it triggered the Battle of Lexington. And this was the beginnings of the American Revolution, and it happened exactly 250 years ago today, this year. 250 years ago was the formal beginning of the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783. It ended with the Treaty of Paris. It was signed between the American Confederation, the Confederation of American States, and the Kingdom of France, with the Kingdom of Great Britain and the British dominions over the sea. That is basically the American Revolution in a nutshell. Milk Cow, how goes the Warhammer? I am doing awesome, Milk Cow. How are you? Willie McDuff says, I am good, Imperator. Hope you are well. Thank you, Willie McDuff. I am doing awesome. I'm doing very great. Nice to see y'all here. Willie McDuff and Milk Cow, I hope you enjoy this series. This is hosted by Praise of Folly, and I've been wanting a long time to do a review of this. Now, this is 52 minutes long, and I might not do all of it in one go. So anyways, we begin in 1750, 1760, in the 18th century, and the European colonists are expanding very quickly. The population is going up dramatically in the colonies, and Americans want more land. The Anglo-Celtic Americans are expanding westwards into Appalachia and into the Alleghenies. They're going out into Tennessee and Kentucky and Ohio, and there is a very big push for land. There is a very strong emphasis on families having children and going out into the wilderness and taming more land. And that's kind of basically where we're at. That's kind of where we're at. At this point, in 1760, all of the entire eastern seaboard from Florida to Maine has already been settled. Florida hasn't really been settled, but Georgia up to Maine is largely already been settled at this point. So we're starting out in Appalachia, and we're going to talk about American foreign policy, number 1, the beginnings. So here we go. All right, as soon as it freaking gets started.
Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis. I'm beginning a new series on the U.S. foreign policy from the Revolutionary era to the present day, and I'll be joined by Keith Preston. Thanks for coming on, Keith. It's always great having you.
Hi, Todd. Glad to be back.
So yeah, I'm thinking that there's 2 points I want to start off with the American foreign policy as it's developed over time. Pat Buchanan makes an interesting point that's certainly disputable in his book, A Republic Not an Empire, where he says that America only became an imperial nation after McKinley, after the invasion of Spain, Cuba and the Philippines. And now David Gordon, who wrote a book review of that in 2000 on the Mises website, argued that it seems fairly odd that Buchanan would make that distinction because it seems somewhat arbitrary.
All right, so for those that don't know, Todd Lewis is affiliated. I don't think he's directly affiliated with the von Mises Institute, but he read a lot of material from the von Mises Institute. So there's a lot of influence from von Mises, who is basically this anarcho-capitalist. He wrote these various works. He's kind of a lot like Ayn Rand in a way. So to understand the political viewpoint, this historical thing is going to be very influenced by interpretations from a von Mises anarcho-capitalist perspective. So it's going to be highly conservative, at least socially conservative, I guess. And they're going to be talking about some things in regards to early American history and a very modern, postmodern interpretation of this period. Keith Preston is a leftist. He is an anarchist, but I think he is a socialist or a collective anarchist. So this is going to be very influenced by by an anarchist perspective, which is probably not something that a lot of people are used to actually watching. So it's going to be very interesting in regards to an anarchist viewpoint on the rise of the North American Republic, the rise of the early United States. But anyways, they're talking about a book by McKinnold, or by McKinney, what was his name, McKinnold? And he wrote this book about American Empire in 1898 and talked about the formal beginnings of American imperialism in the Spanish-American War. But what they're going to do is they're going to argue that America's manifest destiny and like America's aims of gathering lands, annexing lands, actually happened at the very beginning, all the way back well into the colonial period. Like, America was born from British imperialism.
Became an imperial nation after McKinley, after the invasion of Spain, Cuba and the Philippines. And now David Gordon, who wrote a book review of that in 2000 on Mises, the Mises website, argued that it seems fairly odd that Buchanan would make that distinction because it seems somewhat arbitrary, given that America had been very expansionist. In fact, those expansionist tendencies led to friction with its colonial overlord Great Britain, as we'll get into a bit later. And then once Gordon basically says, well, once you conquer from sea to sea, well, why not just go out into other countries? Because now, you're able to do that. Now, I think in Buchanan's defense, one point that is a sea change is, George Washington's address warned us of foreign entanglements.
Okay, so
at that point,
after his second administration, George Washington wrote what is called his final address. And George Washington basically warned the American public not to try to get involved in European wars, or even in wars in the Americas. Now, George Washington did not include slave uprisings or wars with the Indians in his final address. Like, he was completely okay with that. But insofar as America, like American soldiers going across the Atlantic and fighting in Europe on European soil, all of the founding fathers were against that. The main thing at this stage that Americans were really concerned with was expansion across the West, the Western frontier, what was already pretty much known as the Wild West, or what would become the Wild West. That was the main thing that Americans were interested in, and in international trade with the East Indies, maybe China, and West Africa, and the West Indies, and like Spanish America, and some parts of Western Europe. Other than that, other than just some trade rights and extension of naval protections for trade, and this is like Adam Smith free trade, America was not interested in getting involved in any kind of like foreign disputes. The founding fathers were completely interested in grabbing up new land as quickly as they could and filling it up with settlers, filling it up with pioneers and fur traders and or fur trappers and others. And the railroad was not yet invented. Like the steam engine was still very much in its infantile state when the American Revolution was being fought, and like the concept of the railroad just didn't really exist, and so it was wagon trains and just settlers going out west and fighting Indians and trading with them also, and just a lot of treaties and stuff with various Indian tribes like the Mohawks, the Cherokee, and just all of these not even plains Indians, but kind of these much more sophisticated adobe dwelling Indians that lived in wigwams and teepees in the forest and built these giant mounds and stuff. And when the Americans found these gigantic mounds, they were really impressed about that this actually existed, and like a lot of these pioneers actually dug up these gigantic mounds like in Cahokia to try to see if there was like treasures or something in it. There was a lot of this treasure digging that was actually being done at this point. So it's very interesting. But for a long time, long before the Wild West, like how people know it to be, Americans were fighting these much more settled agrarian Indian tribes that built these gigantic mounds and even put fence around their wigwams or wagrams and teepees, and like they were very interested. There was even like these talks about some of these tribes speaking Welsh or Hebrew, and possibly being Welsh or being Hebrews or Israelites and Phoenicians. And there was just a lot of this going on. This is like the 18th century. This is the 18th century we're talking about, and like this is before the beginnings of like modern archaeology, modern human anthropology as such. But anyways, yeah, and so I'll be talking a lot about that in this.
Led to friction with its colonial overlord Great Britain, as we'll get into a bit later.
Yeah, actually, the British did not want the Americans to go further west than the Appalachians or the Alleghenies. The Alleghenies is a mountain range that's east of Appalachia. It's to the east of Appalachia, and it's right in the middle of Pennsylvania and New York, and like down through to Georgia. It's right before Appalachia, right before Tennessee and Kentucky. And the British actually tried to prevent settlers from going into that region, into the Alleghenies. And there was actually laws passed to where Americans could not, Anglo-Celtic Americans, British Americans could not settle any further west than the Alleghenies. And sometimes not even that far west. And this led to actually this hunger for land and hunger for settlement west led to clashes with Westminster and with the Parliament in Westminster and Whitehall.
And then once they, Gordon basically says, well, once you conquer from sea to sea, well, why not just go out into other countries? Because now, you're able to do that. Now, I think in Buchanan's defense, one point that is a sea change is, George Washington's Farewell Address warned us of foreign entanglements. And at that point, after McKinley, that was thrown to the wind. And so there is some distinction to be made, but I think Pat Buchanan overplays his hand. And after all, Madison and Adams in the Federalist Papers both described the United States as an empire of liberty. In fact, one of the arguments from the Federalist Papers was small republics always fail because they get conquered by larger neighbors. and that they wanted to create a large republic like Rome, an imperial republic that would be large enough to defend itself and preserve, as they saw it, the virtues of liberty. So, do you have anything to say or add to this sort of starting off point here?
Well, I think the problem with Buchanan's analysis is that he seems to only focus on overseas imperialism that has been engaged in by the United States throughout its history. He seems to have this idea that the American westward expansion, or even American expansionism into Latin America or the Pacific during the 19th century, was somehow not imperialistic, or was somehow not an empire. And I think David Gordon was absolutely correct when he said that that's a bit of an arbitrary distinction. I think that Buchanan's has this idea that America is basically the continental United States that Americans were somehow entitled to, and that things only started to go off track and when the United States began to become embroiled in the politics of Europe and Asia. And I think that that's a fairly limited critique of U.S. imperialism. I think you're right in the sense that if we go back and look at the founding documents of the United States and what the people who founded the United States actually believed, we see that what they were trying to do was create what amounted to a reconstruction of the Roman Republic in North America. And right from the start, they had this idea of, as you said, an empire of liberty, something that would expand westward continually. I mean, if we go back and we read the writings of early American leaders as far back as the 18th century, they're talking about all of the lucrative resources that are to the west and to the south and what's now called Latin America. We have to consider that one of the principal contributing factors to the American Revolution itself was the fact that the colonies were continually trying to expand westward, and the British were resistant to this for a range of reasons. One reason is that the British did not want to have the colonies constantly engaged in war with the American Indian nations. And one of the causes of the revolution was the fact that the British would not provide troops to cover the Western expansion as it was going on, and that the American Indians would retaliate, and there would be violence there. And that it even talks about that in the Declaration of Independence, about how the British have failed to protect the colonies from the so-called merciless Indian savages. And what that was about was the westward expansion that was going on, and then the skirmishes with the American Indian nations that were actually taking place. So that we see this kind of expansionism really even before the United States as a nation was even created.
Okay, so this is something that goes all the way back to Jamestown and Plymouth. From the very beginning that the Europeans, and especially the British, started to settle the North American wilderness, they were after riches and wealth. They were after the gold that the Spanish had plundered out of the Aztec Empire. And one of the goals was to try to find the city of El Dorado, to actually try to find like something akin to what the Spanish had done when they were in the New World in the 16th century. So the primary thing that you find in the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers is this idea of the Empire of Liberty. Thomas Jefferson said that America was an empire of liberty. In fact, it's even written in the Constitution. And the idea was that all men are born free and are naturally inclined to these inalienable natural rights. The rights of liberty, the rights of freedom of the press, freedom of speech, the right to political organizing, the right to assembly, the right to a speedy and just trial by jury. All these things were fundamentally accepted in the 18th century. Absolutely fundamental. And it was believed that this empire of liberty its natural destiny was to conquer the North America. And there's a lot of these ramblings about the new Roman Republic. The founding fathers were obsessed with the Delian League, they were obsessed with the Achaean League, with the Roman Republic, with Athens, and like Rome when it was expanding as a republic around the Mediterranean. Like the Americans were already, well before the War of Independence, starting to act and claim to be more of a land-based empire than a sea empire. The British just wanted to extend trading rights and expand overseas. They were an island nation. America was a continental nation. It had, other than Spain and Britain, no externalized borders with other countries. It basically was just free to expand as it wanted to. One of the things the founding fathers talked about and wanted was to go westward and southwards into the viceroyalty of New Spain. Go into Florida, Puerto Rico, Cuba, Santo Domingo, go into the viceroyalty of New Spain and annex these lands and these territories. And the Americans were very angry and upset that the British king did not implant sentries on the western border to help protect the colonizers and the settlers going westwards, or to provide stationed troops of regulars and militiamen and whatnot to help like expand further westward and southwards to actually try to fight these Indian tribes and to take their lands, and exploit the riches and wealth of the soil and mining and whatnot. So the founding fathers were very much ahead of their time. They were very industrious and lucrative, and they really wanted to to get this land. And so America was an empire from the beginning. It's not as if America only started to become an empire with William McKinley. It started well before that. And America was already sending soldiers to fight the Barbary pirates of North Africa already in really the beginning of the 1800s. And there was the first and the second Barbary Wars. So Americans were already fighting and doing stuff overseas and getting involved in fighting the Barbary pirates of Tunis and Algiers. And there was already a lot going on in regards to expansionism and stuff like that. Very patriarchal Christian society, very hyper-Calvinist. One of the things that they did not touch was the influence of the Frenchman John Calvin. John Calvin, the Protestant reformer, and the strong influence of Calvinism and the French and Scottish Enlightenment into these ideas of this empire of liberty and just this empire that was going to grow and conquer the wilderness and turn it into the new Rome. So the idea is that we are the new Roman Republic. We're going to expand westwards, and we're going to create this empire of liberty, and it's going to be the greatest thing ever. So even back then, 250 years ago, Americans were very much on board with this concept. And it shows just how very little has changed.
About how the British have failed to protect the colony from the so-called merciless Indian savages, and what that was about was the westward expansion that was going on, and then the skirmishes with the American Indian nations that were actually taking place. So that we see this kind of expansionism really even before the United States as a nation was even created. Even the colonies themselves were expansionist in nature, and then the United States is formed as an independent republic, modeled very closely on the Roman Republic, and it continues to expand westward. It continues to expand into all of the American Indian territories. What about the Trail of Tears? I mean, one of the ways that the Southern plantation system got started and really developed into what it was in the early 19th century is the fact that you had all of these American Indian nations. There were about five major American Indian nations, like the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Creek, and the Seminoles that were based in the southeastern region of the United States. And a lot of the plantation interests wanted to continue to expand westward, and they wanted this territory, and that led to the passing of the Indian Exclusion Act of 1830, that in turn led to the Trail of Tears, where five American Indian nations were forcibly relocated westward. You know, about a third of the people that were relocated died during this time. And all of this is long before the Civil War, before the Mexican War, before many decades before the Spanish-American War, or the Philippine War, or any of these things that are supposed to be the turning point that lead into the formation of the American Empire.
Yeah, a couple of points here. I think it's illustrative, since we seem to agree that the United States was originally conceived as an expansionist polity. I think maybe in two points that are interesting to explain the origin of that ideology. The United States has both a secular and a Puritan tradition that often converge at points. The Puritan tradition views this as the new Israel, and the Indians were perceived as the Canaanites. The preacher Ezra Stiles in 1783 said that the Native Americans were the new Canaanites, and we, as the people of God, had the right to exterminate them to gain the land for ourselves. But we also have as well this kind of new Atlantis mentality. Bacon, I think it was Francis Bacon, the Renaissance Bacon, wrote a book called The New Atlantis, where he talks about, it's more of an allegory of this sort of enlightened nation of science and learning that, it was lost and was now recently discovered. And the United States has kind of seen itself as this embodiment of Enlightenment principles of, freedom and liberty and human rights and whatever you want to call those values. And those values itself are also demanding, right? All the other people that aren't, humanists or don't believe in liberty are reactionary and tyrannical and must be deposed, as we often hear with all this saber-rattling with Assad right now. And so we have converging this Puritan element and this sort of secular Enlightenment element, both justifying an expansionist American empire at the expense of the Native Americans. They're dehumanized in different ways, right? They're dehumanized from the Puritan perspective as being re-examples of Canaanites, and from the Enlightenment perspective, they're dehumanized as being ignorant savages that are standing in the way of progress and reason.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right in that these two things are the.
All right, so early on in American history, there is a very strong, and like I just said, the influence of John Calvin of Geneva in the 1500s. Like, it's very interesting that even though John Calvin and Martin Luther and these other reformers were not American, their ideas permeated far more in the United States, like they did in South Africa, than they ever did in Europe. Like, most of these ideas did not really flourish in Europe. They flourished even more in America. Now, Code of Truth, and I don't mean to bring him up, had talked about the Quebec Act, which basically expanded the province of Quebec into Michigan and Ohio and Indiana, and this meant that Catholics were allowed to settle in these regions. And the Anglo-American colonists resented this because they feared that there was a Catholic conspiracy, a Catholic Jesuit conspiracy to try to Catholicize or papalize the colonies. And a lot of Baptist and Calvinist ministers spoke out against this and were talking about this in the early years of the Revolution, the Revolutionary War of Independence, about the British supposedly siding with French-Canadian Catholic priests and Jesuits and trying to spread these negative influences or something, or perceived negative influences. But it's funny because 10% of Maryland was already Roman Catholic in 1776. And John Carroll, a Roman Catholic from Maryland, was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. And yeah, this is one of the things that I'm ashamed to be American. This is definitely one of the things that I'm personally am ashamed to be born American for, is this religious Calvinist hysteria. But regardless, the two main points of this emergent American perspective is the influence of the Pilgrims, the influence of the Puritans, who were a different sect than the Pilgrims were, by the way. And this kind of Puritan mentality of Americans has the new Israel, the new Israelites, and the Indians has the new Canaanites. The Native Americans were seen as Canaanites, Americans as Israelites, and it was this religious fanaticism, Calvinistic, hyper-Calvinistic religious fanaticism and prejudice towards the Native Americans and towards the African slaves. And then the other one was this enlightened secularism of the 18th century, of Enlightenment influence and Enlightenment humanism that basically was absolutely insane. Just absolute insane secular humanism that emerged out of the Enlightenment. The founding fathers were also into this scientific centered, Newtonian centered thing. So one of the influences of the Enlightenment was Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton and his theories on gravitational rotations, the rotational properties of gravity, and the idea of like you can throw something into space and it will go on in a continuum forever, basically. The new scientific discoveries around gravity, the laws of physics, the laws of thermodynamics, the philios, and just all of these new ideas that shaped the Enlightenment. These ideas also shaped and influenced Benjamin Franklin as well as the Founding Fathers. The Founding Fathers were very much Calvinist. They were Puritans. Now, John Carroll was a Roman Catholic, and he did sign the Declaration of Independence. And the founder of the American Navy was an Irish Roman Catholic named James Barry. So there were Catholics that did fight for the patriot cause. Code of Truth either has been misinformed by Freemasons, or he is supporting a Freemasonic agenda himself. If Code of Truth has been misinformed, then I understand, but if he has not been misinformed, then I think that he is probably a Freemason, and he is pushing a Freemasonic agenda against American Catholics. Now, that being said, and by the way, that is not slander to nobody, that being said, Puritanism, English Puritanism, and English puritanical ideas, and religious fanaticism, racial prejudice, and Enlightenment liberalism, old classical Enlightenment liberalism, all played very important and distinctive roles. There was people in the 17th century like Sir Francis Bacon who wrote The New Atlantis. And I do not have the time to go in depth into it, but it also had a very big influence on a concept of a secular utopian society that was founded on perfect rationalism. That also played into the Founding Fathers' agenda. So here are some of the ideas in regards to what was pushing the Revolutionary War in the 18th century.
Expansionist American empire at the expense of the Native Americans. They're dehumanized in different ways. Right, they're dehumanized from the Puritan perspective as being examples of Canaanites. And from the Enlightenment perspective, they're dehumanized as being ignorant savages that are standing in the way of progress and reason.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right in that these two things.
Yeah, isn't that interesting, by the way? That sounds just like the woke. That sounds just exactly like something the woke left would say. It sounds just like something that the woke left would say. These progressives will say that the right are ignorant, they're barbarians, and they're primitive, and they stand in the way of progress. Well, this is the kind of thing that the American founding fathers were saying about African slaves, Native Americans, and backward monarchical Europeans. You know, it's just, this is the same thing. Okay? This is the exact same thing right here. So, whenever a libertarian tells you that the founding fathers were actually conservatives, they're lying to you. They're lying straight to your face. The founding fathers were progressive liberals. Okay? Yeah, they had a racial perspective, but they were still liberal progressives. Like, there's nothing conservative about any of these founding fathers. Benjamin Franklin himself was in the Hellfire Club, which reportedly or purportedly was involved in the occult. Like, a lot of these people were Freemasons. They either all became Freemasons just before the outbreak of the Revolution, or they became Freemasons afterwards. So the founding fathers had good ideas, but they were extremely intolerant. And at the same time, they were very progressive in their viewpoints. Like, this is not the bedrock of conservatism. I don't know who tells people this. Like, none of the founding fathers were truly conservative. They were very radical and very revolutionary. And they had to be because of the material conditions of the time period. The material conditions of this time period simply accounted for this kind of fuming radicalism. This was Protestant radicalism. And of course, the Native Americans were dehumanized. The Native Americans were victims of this Protestant fanaticism.
And from the Enlightenment perspective, they're dehumanized as being ignorant savages that are standing in the way of progress and reason.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right in that these two things are the set the tone for the whole ideological mood of what the United States becomes. This kind of Puritan religious messianism on one hand, and this kind of secular Enlightenment messianism on the other hand. These two things converge, and it's sort of like the idea that America becomes God's chosen nation to spread the Enlightenment throughout the world, or something like that. It's a very strange convergence of ideas. In fact, there was...
And that's the aspect of the right wing, okay? Isn't that not what the Republican Party says? Like, the Democratic Party will talk about how socially progressive and ahead of their time the Founding Fathers were, and the Republican Party will say that America is a chosen nation. It is a messianic guided nation that is destined to spread these Enlightenment philosophies throughout the world. These ideas of the new humanity, the new Atlantis, and the new age, the new ideas of 1776. So even back then, this is true. And the Republican Party, to this very day, says that America is God's chosen nation. Well, the Founding Fathers also believed this. They believed in a Protestant mission, a Puritan Calvinist mission, to spread these Enlightenment, progressive ideas throughout the world. That is an aspect the Republican Party gets right.
There's an essay written back in the late 60s by it's sort of like the idea that America becomes God's chosen nation to spread the Enlightenment throughout the world or something like that. It's a very strange convergence of ideas. Um, in fact, there was an essay written back in the late 60s by Robert Bellah. Robert Bellah was a sociologist of religion, and he wrote this essay called The Civil Religion in America, which outlined this idea of what the American civil religion is as it can be identified in the speeches of leading public figures going back to the founding generation. And he talks about how this civil religion is not Christianity. It may borrow some from the language of Christianity, but it's more like a kind of nationalistic deism in the sense that it has the idea of a America as God's chosen nation, and America has this special historic mission to bring freedom and democracy or whatever to the world. And that idea, this civil religion, has always existed. It goes back to the founding generation. You see it during the Civil War period. I mean, there were even songs written about it, like the Battle Hymn of the Republic. I mean, you can actually read the lyrics to that. That's exactly what it is. It's this American civil religion, and then it continues to take on new forms. Like right now, there's one form that's dominant. Perhaps there was another form that was dominant during the middle 20th century, and then perhaps there was another form that was dominant during the era of the Philippine War and that kind of thing. But there's always been this ideological foundation to American imperialism that has this kind of messianic zeal behind it. It's really interesting and does represent a fairly strange convergence of ideas that I don't think we really see in any other nation from what I'm familiar with.
Yeah, I would agree. Given the sort of theological tenets of deism and those of the Puritan Presbyterians and Congregationalists, it's an awfully strange amalgamation. But one of the key incentives for the founding generation to rebel against the English was the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which,
So, deism is this idea. It's not atheism, but it's basically an early form of proto-atheism. It's a form of proto-atheism that basically God did make the universe, but the way that he made the universe is not known. And it's very Platonic in a way. It's very Platonic. But basically God is a clockmaker. He made everything, but he set everything on a clock. And then he left that clock alone, and the clock is now basically autonomous and works completely independently of the clocksmith. That's kind of the general breakdown of deism. And deism, I think, was just basically a way for this like 300, 500 different Protestant sects all throughout the colonies to basically identify with a common patriotic cause. Because you had Presbyterians, Congregationalists, Quakers, the Society of Friends, Baptists, New Age Baptists, Methodists, and Puritans and Congregationalists, and just all these different sects. There were probably like well over 100 different sects in the United States in the American Revolution. And what the Founding Fathers did was they got them together with the civil religion, which is not Christianity. It is not state Christianity. Regardless of what evangelicals say, it is not Christianity. It is a civil messianic religion that basically identifies America as the new Israel and God's chosen people, and that America has a special mission in the world, a special civilizing mission. in which America can basically do whatever it wants because it's just these blend of ideas that really basically are the fountain pen of the American way of life, the American idea, the American conception of self. And it is a mixture of Calvinism and the Enlightenment. It's a mixture of liberalism and some aspects of British conservatism. And it's very weird, but it's a unique American blend. And I think that the founding fathers used deism as a way to unite these many different warring and striving Protestant groups together in a common patriotic cause. Get these various states together into a common patriotic cause to fight the British. So anyways, I'm now going to talk about, or they're going to talk about, one of the primary reasons for the American Revolution. Contrary to what Code of Truth falsely said and bore false witness against other people about, it wasn't necessarily the Quebec Act alone that caused the American Revolution. Had Code of Truth been paying attention and actually really read world or American history, he would know about the Royal Proclamation of 1763. But Code of Truth decides to cherry pick ideas because he doesn't have a proper citation or a proper understanding of this period.
Tenets of deism and those of the Puritan Presbyterians and Congregationalists is an awfully strange amalgamation. But one of the key incentives for the founding generation to rebel against the English was the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which, so after the French and Indian War, the North American front of the 7 Years' War, the French Empire, which covered most of the Ohio Valley, much of the West, was divided between England and Spain along the Mississippi River. And everything east of the Mississippi went to England, everything west went to Spain. And between the Appalachians and the Mississippi, the British had said, by law, you cannot settle beyond the Appalachians. And that was also seen as the Indian Reserve Act. And the colonists, with this expansionist tendency, didn't like that. They wanted to go all the way to the Pacific. And so that was one component of the American incentive to go to war with England.
Yeah, I think you're right. Well, I also think that a major issue was probably the fact that the anti-slavery movement was starting to develop in England as well. England was really the first modern nation to really eradicate the slave trade, and I suspect a lot of slave interest in the colonies understood that. They saw the writing on the wall as far as what was happening there as well, and they thought that independence would be a way to prevent the abolition movement from spreading to North America. But the issue is that if you look at how the first generation of American leaders and the ones after that as well, if you look at how they viewed Europe and how they viewed the American Indians as well, on one hand they viewed themselves as the superior enlightened people, and they viewed the American Indians as these barbarian savages on one hand, and they also viewed the Spanish as this reactionary, traditional monarchical society. So they were, there's always been in American politics a kind of contempt for old Europe. Like even recently, even relatively recently, when the Iraq War was going on, and some of the European nations declined to support the American war effort, there were leading American figures, even in the 21st century, Donald Rumsfeld and some others, I think, who were talking about old Europe. Those old Europeans over there, those reactionaries. They don't know what they're doing. While we were over here liberating the world, that seems to have been a strand in American political culture ever since the beginning, and you see it during the westward expansion of a particular figure. This whole idea that the Americans are this chosen nation, and they're these American Indian nations are they're not even human. They're just like glorified animals, and they have a similar view of the Europeans. The Europeans are this backward reactionary culture that we've broken away from. It's somewhat odd today when we hear nationalists like talk about when we hear European nationalists talk about the America as an outpost of European civilization. I tend to disagree with that. I tend to think that America was more of a repudiation of European civilization as much as it was an outgrowth of it on one hand, but it was a repudiation on the other hand. I gave a speech at National Policy Institute once where I said that America is to Europe what Frankenstein's monster was to Dr. Frankenstein. It was a creation that got out of control and went crazy. And I think that's kind of the way that the relationship between the United States and Europe has been historically.
That's actually a really good analogy. I don't think the English really planned on having this happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, so in a sense, like, the United States is indeed an outgrowth of Western Europe, or Northwestern Europe, very much, and particularly the British Isles. There is definitely a lot of influence from the British Isles on America, and any American that ever says otherwise is a fool to themselves and to others. Okay? Because they're using the English language when they say that. Any American that uses the English language to tell you that is delusional and deluding themselves. But at the same time, we're not an outgrowth of Europe. We're a product, America is a product of European colonization, but it is not a new Europe. It is much more of a new Israel than anything else. Like, the United States has always tried to have this vision of being basically a New Testament Israelite empire. It basically is that's basically exactly what it is. Like, the early Americans saw themselves as the new Israelites. And all of these different Indian exclusion acts, Native American resettlement acts, reflects the book of Joshua in the Old Testament. Americans just basically see themselves as the Christian Israel, the new Israel. And the plantation interests, the planters and the slaveholders, they basically got together to kick out the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Creek Indians, and the Seminoles, and the 5 civilized Indian nations, and they sent them to Oklahoma. They were forced to leave Georgia, South Carolina, and Tennessee and whatnot and go to Oklahoma. Sent them to the Indian Territory because they wanted that land. They wanted to farm and mine that land and build like southern plantations on it. So the Indian Expulsion Act of 1830 is a good example of this very highly biblical-centric and messianic-centric identity of this emerging manifest destiny. Horace Greeley said, "Go west, young man." Horace Greeley was a New York senator or a New York congressman, and he actually had some early socialist ideas. And he was talking about the importance of people and settlers going west, colonizing and populating the western states. And Horace Greeley was a very big supporter of that. So yeah, one of the things that don't get talked about, one of the things that do not get talked about is the slave interest. The interest of the slave power with the founding fathers in wanting to continue the slave trade and continue the policy of owning slaves and transporting slaves to American plantations and harnessing the slave power to grow plantation crops and these planter crops like tobacco, rice, indigo, and especially cotton. Like those commodities were very centrally important to the American economy, North and South. And the abolitionist movement was already emerging in Britain by the time of the Revolution, and the Revolutionary War accelerated the end of slavery in the British Empire. It actually began to push the British to abolishing the transatlantic slave trade. The Americans kept it for another 20 or so years, or 30 years after the War of Independence, and then slavery did not end until like another 80 something years. And it was actually the American Revolution that led the British to getting rid of the transatlantic slave trade and getting rid of slavery altogether, and going out in these ships to stop slave traders in West Africa and whatnot. And then, even back then, Americans had a very degrading view about the Europeans. They considered the Europeans to be a bunch of old, backward, feudal landholders and just these backward Europeans and stuff. Like in 2003, during the Iraq War, Donald Rumsfeld gave a public speech talking about the old Europeans, backward, feudal-minded Europeans, and the backward old European mentality and stuff like that. So the Europeans were considered to be backward, autocratic, feudal or neo-feudal, absolute royalist and monarchist. And like Spain was going to cause stagnation in the Americas. That's why the Americans wanted to go to the viceroyalty of New Spain, expand into Spanish and Indian territories, and try to like get rid of these autocratic Spaniards, autocratic monarchical Spaniards, and these these savage Indian nations, as the founding fathers said, and like try to spread a Protestant Enlightenment civilization westwards, a prevalently Anglo-American civilization out west, and settle these backward lands, colonize them, and break away from the old Europe. And the founding fathers were talking about how greater and how so much better and unique America was, the New World was, to this old world mentality, and just this old world mentality of these old Europeans. And then, of course, the British created a royal proclamation in 1763 which banned Anglo-Celtic American settlement west of the Alleghenies. So the Anglo-Americans could not settle west of the Alleghenies. And at the same time, there was also some anti-Catholic and anti-non-white visceralism as well. So it's a mixture of old classical republicanism and Protestant Calvinist religious fanaticism and some racial bigotry mixed in together, and also the idea of keeping the slave interests going, keeping the slave power going, and breaking away from abolitionist England, abolitionist-centric England, to keep slavery and the transatlantic slave trade afloat, even if for perhaps a limited time.
About the America as an outpost of European civilization. I tend to disagree with that. I tend to think that America was more of a repudiation of European civilization as much as it was an outgrowth of it on one hand, but it was a repudiation on the other hand. I gave a speech at National Policy Institute once where I said that, America is to Europe what Frankenstein's monster was to Dr. Frankenstein. It was a creation that got out of control and went crazy. And I think that's kind of the way that the relationship between the United States and Europe has been historically.
That's actually a really good analogy. I don't think the English really planned on having this happen when they first settled here. Within the American Revolution, another thing we can see is to highlight the aggressive expansionism, even in the birthing of our country. was what is one of the first things that we do in 1775 and 1776? We invade Canada. I mean, we invade Canada, and it was perceived to be a weak and soft target, which would offer, because of the controlling of the straits and the fur trade, would give us an economic advantage. But we ultimately were not prepared for Canada, and we would later invade again in 1812. So the most powerful empire in the world, we're fighting for our life, and the first thing we do is we invade Canada. It just kind of shows you how aggressive and devil-may-care the Americans are.
Yeah, well, it's interesting to go back and actually look at what happened during the Revolutionary War in the late 18th century. There were hundreds of thousands of refugees that were created by that war, many of whom went to Canada during the course of the war. And there was a lot of, in the colonies, there was a lot of vigilante violence against Tories, against English loyalists. A lot of those fled to Canada. It's also interesting to consider the historical trajectory that the United States has followed and compared to other nations that were once English colonies, like Canada, like Australia, like New Zealand. What we see today is that Canada and Australia and some of these other nations of the Anglosphere that are outgrowths of the British Empire in the same, with pretty much the same history, managed to be successful modern functional societies without having a violent revolution where they broke off with the empire itself. So that calls into question the whole legitimacy, I think, of the American Revolution. I know there's a lot of libertarian types who say, well, there were only two good wars in American history, or three good wars, and one is always the Revolution, and then another one is usually the World War II, and sometimes they're depending on your predilections. There's the Civil War or the War of Southern Independence or whatever. But
yeah, Rothbard said the Civil War was one of the good ones for the South.
Yeah, but the more I look at the American Revolution, the more I come to the point of view that what was the point? I mean, it was again, like today, talking about freedom. I mean, today the Americans, the Canadians, and the Australians have roughly the same liberties, with some differences, I guess, but pretty much the same. And so for that matter, do the British. So it's they're all pretty much the same civilization, same basic culture, same basic politics. Um, but it does seem though that the American first generation of Americans that came out of the American Revolution were very much about revolting against the empire, not just for independence, but for expansionist purposes. The empire, it's like they viewed their status as colonies as an albatross that prevented expansionism. And it's not merely that they wanted independence, but that they wanted to remove the constraining hand of the British Empire as a means of moving west.
Yeah, so I probably, had I lived 250 years ago, I would have ultimately been pro independence from Britain or from England, but that doesn't mean that, I would have necessarily thought that this revolution that happened would have been altogether just a good thing. I mean, I certainly don't think the American Revolution was a godsend. Or, it was influenced by secular Enlightenment philosophy and by Protestant messianism. Like, the American Revolution was a very violent, very blood-stained thing entirely. And there's no such thing as a good war. Be it the American Revolution, the Civil War, or World War II, or the Vietnam War, or the Korean War, or the Spanish-American War, or the Iraq War, or the Peloponnesian War, or any war, period. All wars, people died. Okay, people died in this American Revolution. Tories were harassed. They were tarred and feathered by patriots. And Tories killed patriots. Tories killed and raped and pillaged patriots. and patriots raped and killed, tortured, maimed, harassed, and tarred and feathered Tories. It was actually a civil war in a way, both in the New England states and the northern states, as well as in the southern states. And anybody who ever gives you any excuse otherwise is fooling you and fooling themselves. Okay? And one of the first things that we did when we started to get independence, we invaded another sovereign nation. Now, it wasn't a sovereign nation yet. It was a British dominion. It had some French settlers, but it was still a British dominion. We invaded a foreign territory that had no interest in joining our patriotic cause for liberty. They wanted to stay under the rule of the King of England, and we invaded a foreign territory. Today it's known as Canada, but back then it was Quebec, Montreal, and kind of Ontario, lower and upper Canada. And I imagine that the Quebec Act was one of the reasons for why the American patriots and the American Continentals did invade. Now, we fought very well. Code of Truth was bitching in my Discord. He was bitching in my Discord about this. And I explained that, we did win some battles, and you guys won some battles. Okay? You don't have to fuss about it all the time. But regardless, taking his side, yes, Americans did invade Canada in 1775 and 1812. Actually, I think it was in 1813. In both the War of Independence and the War of 1812. The War of 1812 kind of went a little bit wild. It kind of got a little bit wild and out of control, but it was irregular warfare. Most of the American Revolution had very few formal battles. It was very different from 18th century Europe. It was actually more guerrilla fighting. It was more guerrillas and bushwhackers or bush hackers and irregular fighting against with these militias that would hide in trees or down in the grass or kind of would camouflage, and they would fight these British regulars and Hessian regulars and win, basically, because they used the act of surprise. They used the land against the British and the Hessians. When they fought the British and the Hessians, or the British and the Germans in this revolution. But, yeah, hundreds of thousands of Tories had their land confiscated by the American government. And they gave it to patriot farmers. Lots of farms and lots of properties and houses of the Tories were taken away from them against their desire, and they were either burned down and destroyed and looted by patriots, or they were sold to patriot families, to patriot farmers, or just completely destroyed in a Carthaginian Punic manner. And Tories did the same thing to patriots. But yeah, the American Revolution was very much a guerrilla war. It was very much a civil war, and an uncivil war at that. And a lot of Tories and a lot of patriots were both unjustly defiled and stuff. And we did invade Canada. Okay, but there were a lot of good things that came out of the American Revolution. And Code of Truth has admitted that the American Constitution is, in some ways, in some respects, superior to the Canadian Constitution. But at the end of the day, you will have to admit, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand did not have this kind of a revolution. They did not have this kind of an early modern revolutionary war, and they have the same basic beliefs and rights of that humans deserve to have. They have the same exact basic individual rights in their constitutions and a bunch of people were not tarred and feathered, bullied and harassed, and raped, looted, pillaged, and killed, and butchered or forced into exile in the hundreds of thousands to get those constitutions. And New Zealand, Australia, and Canada have basically the same types of constitutions and rights as the United States does, because they're all Anglosphere countries, and they're all very highly individualist. The only difference is they didn't fight a revolution to get that. So that's actually quite something unique about the United States.
The empire, not just for independence, but for expansionist purposes. The empire, it's like they viewed their status as colonies, as an albatross that prevented expansionism. And not it's not merely that they wanted independence, but that they wanted to remove the constraining hand of the British Empire as a means of.
Yeah, they wanted to get rid of a system called mercantilism. And this is interesting, but the British really were big believers in mercantilism. The British were very much strong believers in this state monopolistic system of mercantilism, keeping as much money and importing as much things and exporting as little as possible, or I'm sorry, exporting as much as possible and importing as little as possible, and being self-sufficient. The colonists felt that this mercantilistic mindset was a detriment, and it was actually an albatross, and the Americans wanted to break free of this, and they wanted to expand westwards too. And the British and the Hessians and the Spaniards were stopping that. They were protruding and stopping the Americans from getting what they wanted. So manifest destiny and settling the West was a major driving force for the revolution too.
Moving westward and building an empire.
Exactly. It's almost like the United States revolted against two things. What it perceived to be the chains of Western expansion that were placed on it by the British, and against, as they perceived it, the reactionary culture of the British monarchy. It wasn't, enlightened enough. They wanted to have a pure Enlightenment society, and England was just a good deal too reactionary for that. Well, I have to agree with your assessment on the American Revolution. About 100,000 people probably died in that conflict. And given that, as you pointed out, other English colonies like Canada, Australia, New Zealand have come out very, very well. I mean, they didn't have to fight a bloody civil war to gain large levels of autonomy, and they've preserved the same institutions of rule of law and civil society that we in Americans take for granted. So, was it really worth 100,000 lives to acquire what would have happened probably anyhow?
Yeah, that's something interesting to consider. Bringing that idea to the table in American political culture is obviously going to be considered heresy, because then it pretty much detracts from the legitimacy of the 4th of July and all of that. But from a purely logical perspective, it does seem to have been the case that the United States has turned out pretty much the same as all these other former British colonies, but none of those had a civil war that led to hundreds of thousands of casualties in the same way that the United States did. And when I say Civil War, I mean the American Revolution. And then, of course, there was the second, the next Civil War, the one we call the Civil War, which was even worse. And again, same thing happened there. I mean, we're getting ahead of ourselves here, but the same thing happened there. I mean, the slavery was ended in all of these other places without that kind of bloodshed. So it's interesting how the United States follows such a bloody trajectory throughout its history. It's like one bloody war after another, and there's always some high-minded ideal associated with it. Though it's always some kind of supposed high-minded ideal. It's like we're the original Trotskyites or something.
Well, exactly, because abolishing slavery everywhere else in the world was more or less peaceful. The English colonies gaining their rights, more or less peaceful. It's like America has to find the most violent way to solve a problem, because when you have a really big hammer and it's your army, everything turns out to be a nail. And if you have a powerful army, but we didn't have a powerful army in the Revolution. England had the powerful army, so It's like it was just our ideology compelled us to that way. But the other point I was going to make out is the sort of aggressiveness of the American spirit. Is so many presidents cut their teeth fighting Native Americans. You had Tippecanoe and Tyler.
Oh yeah. Cutting teeth with fighting Native Americans was a pastime. For us Americans, like cutting our teeth fighting the Indians was a pastime in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. And then we went overseas and did it with the Kaiser, with the Nazis and the Japanese, Hirohito, and then the Koreans and Vietnamese and Iraqis and so on. But, and this was going on before the War of Independence or even the conception of American destiny. America is very much an ideological land. It is a land of high-mindedness and I wouldn't say the most fanatical ideas, but pretty radical ideas, at least relative to this time period. Now, as America aged and matured and grew, its viewpoints and the way that it dealt with domestic and foreign affairs softened a bit. But in this time period, there is a rejection of the autocracy of the British, of this what was perceived as being this extremely hereditary-based aristocratic society, if not an outright autocracy in Britain at Westminster and Whitehall in London, and just the perception of this despotic aristocracy and just this posh haughtiness, this posh-minded, high-minded haughtiness of the ruling aristocracy. The American Revolution was, more than anything else, a rejection of that. For sure, it was a rejection of that aristocratic mindset and just this almost medieval, certainly early modern royalist society. In the American Revolution, the Americans got rid of all of the notion of aristocratic privileges, royalist incentives. That was all ended and done away with. So on the one hand, getting rid of the royal monarchical despotism, expanding westward and taking land from the Spaniards, the British, and the Native Americans, expanding westwards with this kind of perceived notion of religious dominance and this special Calvinist Puritan mission and civilizing Enlightenment mission. And so old royalist Europe was rejected. So America is really not necessarily an outpost of European civilization. It is just more of an aspect of these ideas that came from Europe, but were then used to reject the royalist aristocratic mindset of Europe and to dominate and expand westwards and southwards in the New World and basically become this special God-given nation or God-given special nation and stuff. And it's extremely, very much narcissistic. This is a very narcissistic mindset. And then, of course, a lot of early American presidents, especially antebellum presidents, almost every one of them was actually a general that fought in some Indian War, the War of 1812, or the Mexican War. Like, every American president was a fighter, basically, or had a strong military orientation.
The English colonies getting their rights more or less peaceful. It's like America has to find the most violent way to solve a problem.
Yeah, like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, for all their issues and stuff, none of them fought this kind of a blood-stained fanatical war to get their rights. They got their basic rights and liberties without a revolution or a civil war, and they have the same basic principles written into their constitutions and founding documents that we have. So what was the American Revolution fought for? like, what was it really fought for? We have the same basic rights and grasp of humanities and Christianity and classicism that these other Anglosphere countries have. So, like, what was the entire point of this?
The United States follows such a bloody trajectory throughout its history. It's like one bloody war after another, and there's always some high-minded ideal associated with it. Though it's always some kind of
Yeah. Now, later in their series, they'll talk about the Jacobins. I do not consider the founding fathers as Jacobins. If anything, they were Girondins or Girondins. The American Revolution was essentially a Girondin revolution, or a right path, patriotic, messianic, religious enlightenment revolution. Well, secular enlightenment and deist revolution. It was Girondin. The French Revolution was a Jacobin revolution. The American Revolution was not Jacobin. You could argue that Tom Paine and Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton were proto-Jacobins, but while you can see some aspects of a Jacobin spirit, high-minded spirit, I don't really think that that comes to the United States until the rise of the abolitionist movement and the Civil War. So I'll be talking a lot about the influence of Jacobinism and when I get to the Civil War. This was much more irregular and really unplanned and disorganized. The Civil War was much more ideological and much more organized and high-minded than the Revolutionary War was. There wasn't a central aspect other than just basically what I've already just described to you people, and it was just basically creating a new Israel or a new Rome. As the federal government gains more power over the states and has the concept of citizenry and citizen duties and stoic duties begin to become more important, then you start to see the framework of an underlying ideology emerge. But America just did not have the professional military or the professional army to invade and conquer Canada. It just wasn't going to happen unless the French Canadians joined the sides of the Americans and fought a common cause with them. But the French Canadians were not going to do that. They were traditional Catholics, and they sided with the British monarchy, who, even though he is not the French king, he is still, in their eyes, preferable to the American Republicans. But anyways, let's continue. But yeah, America always finds the most violent and fanatical way of doing things.
But from a purely logical perspective, it does seem to have been the case that the United States has turned out pretty much the same as all of these other former British colonies, but none of those had a civil war that led to hundreds of thousands of casualties in the same way that the United States did. And when I say Civil War, I mean the American Revolution. And then,
oh yeah, I don't think that 100,000 people died in the American Revolutionary War per se. I don't think it was that high, but it was pretty staggering. 60,000 British and Hessians died, and about 26,000 Americans died. American patriots, not American Tories. So it is true that the revolution was not a particularly brutal massacre, but people still died. I mean, 60 to 70,000 deaths is still a very high fatality rate, especially for the 18th century. So, people died. A lot of people died because of this revolution, this American War of Independence against the British Empire.
second, the next Civil War, the one we call the Civil War, which was even worse. Um, and again, same thing happened there. I mean, we're getting ahead of ourselves here, but the same thing happened there. I mean, the slavery was ended in all of these other places without that kind of bloodshed. So it's interesting how the United States follows such a bloody trajectory throughout its history. It's like one bloody war after another, and there's always some high-minded ideal associated with it. There was always some kind of supposed high-minded ideal. It's like we're the original Trotskyites or something.
Exactly, because abolishing slavery everywhere else in the world was more or less peaceful. The English colonies gaining their rights, more or less peaceful. It's like America has to find the most violent way to solve a problem, because when you have a really big hammer and it's your army, everything turns out to be a nail. And if you have a powerful army, but we didn't have a powerful army in the Revolution. England had the powerful army, so it's like it was just our ideology compelled us to that way. But the other point I was going to make out is the sort of aggressiveness of the American spirit. Is so many presidents cut their teeth fighting Native Americans. You had Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Which president was that? William Henry Harrison. Yeah, he fought in the war against Tecumseh, and then in was it the Black Hawk War? I think you had Jackson fought down in Tennessee against those people. And so many presidents in the early republic cut their teeth as Indian fighters, and that was kind of like the bragging rights. We're Indian fighters.
Yeah, that was a fundamental component of what was considered to be an ideal leader in early America. We're talking pre-Civil War, antebellum America. Is many of the presidents from that time period. That's what they were. They were military officers, and what did they do? They were wage war against American Indian nations.
Exactly. Now, after the American Revolution, actually, there's one important point I want to bring out here too, with American foreign policy. The American Way of War, which was written by Russell F. Weegley, very influential book. It ends, I think, right before Vietnam, because it was published right before Vietnam. And he talks about how American policy changed, and we'll get into the details later. But in the beginning, we had more of an irregular warfare style tactic. Militias, bushwhackers, snipers, and the British really hated that. And then, with the Civil War, we begin to change into a war of annihilation. Now, in part against the Native Americans, who were always the weaker force in any of these fights, the war of annihilation was always practiced. Against the British and the Mexicans, we pursued more of an indirect method of fighting because we were weaker. But when we were stronger, we did have the war of annihilation against Indians. But then once the Civil War comes to place, America's strong enough to wage a war of annihilation without fear of reprisal. And I think America only ever pursued a policy of indirect warfare because we were weak. Our national spirit impelled us to a war of annihilation, and once we were strong enough to implement it universally, we did.
Yeah, I think that if you look at American
Yeah, so we had a military force, but our army was very small. Like we had an army, we didn't really have a strong standard army. We did have, by the War of 1812, America did have a professional military force. Like West Point did exist, and at least by the late 1810s, West Point was already graduating some very important professional generals and officers. So, I mean, we did have West Point, but our army was small. Like, the American military was very small and very irregular. And in most of these early wars, we used bushwhackers and like Indian scouts and bushwhackers and guerrillas, and just very irregular guerrilla or disorganized warfare. It was kind of sort of like what the early Romans did. If you look at the history of Rome and the history of early America, there's a lot of commonalities in that regard. Um, when we fought the British and later the Mexicans, we did have an army. We did have a professional army. We did have a professional military force, and we did have technology. And we did fight better than them. But it was not a strong force. We were not a strong military nation. Now, when we could, like in the war against Black Hawk, we would fight a ideologically motivated war of annihilation against Black Hawk and Tecumseh. And Andrew Jackson did a lot of similar things in his war against Tecumseh that later Sherman and Grant, as well as Stonewall Jackson, would later do in the Civil War. In essentially just total warfare. But we didn't have yet the capacity to engage in industrialized total war just yet. So it's not total war in the modern sense, but it is definitely a war of annihilation, of annihilating enemy tribes and enemy nations and enemy chiefs. And this, a lot of Southern nationalists will lie to themselves, and they'll say that American aggression only started with the Civil War. That's not true. American aggression or federal aggression started well before the Civil War, and Southern nationalists will not talk about that. So there's a lot of true statements that both the Yankees and the Southerners will say, but all it is just disconjointed rhetoric from this period. Like, the founding fathers would have never completely agreed with the Yankees or the Southerners. They would have agreed on trying to create and mold a Roman republic or a new Israelite nation that would be Christian and follow the emphasis of the New Testament, basically. This is, okay, they're kind of getting a little bit ahead with these Native American wars and stuff, and I think they're about to go into the War of 1812 in just a bit, but yeah, a lot of early American generals and American presidents directly fought hand to hand, bayonet to bayonet charge, and lance to lance with Indians. Like, these people were very tough, okay? They were farmers and pioneers, and they were very tough people. And that's just something that people like Code of Truth cannot get through his mind, just how tough Americans really were, and how incredibly brutally hard it was for a Canadian to fight an American or a Mexican to fight an American. He doesn't get it in his mind just how tough Americans really were at this time. Now, later on, it's used for an unjust cause. But anyways, this is the beginnings of imperialism. Like, the early 19th century is the formal beginnings of massive imperialism, but Americans do it a little bit differently from the Europeans.
To wage a war of annihilation without fear of reprisal. And I think America only ever pursued a policy of indirect warfare because we were weak. Our national spirit impelled us to a war of annihilation, and once we were strong enough to implement it universally, we did.
Yeah, I think that if you look at the history of American war, there's a great deal of brutality involved in American war right from the beginning. The form of warfare that the Americans had inherited from Europe was the old line and column model of warfare that it developed over the past several centuries before that, and this is something that had almost made war into almost like a sport. I mean, it wasn't really a sport; people still got killed and all that. But compared to modern war, it was almost like a sporting event in many ways, although obviously a high stakes one. And the American Revolutionary War was in many ways a break from that, in the sense that it was the Americans that started to learn how to use tactics like ambushes and more like modern guerrilla warfare. And then that seems to expand over time to where it's not just about defeating the enemy; it's about totally annihilating their civilization. Of course, with the American Indians, the Americans viewed those as subhuman. They were just another thing to consider is that the ideas people had about things like race and ethnicity back then were such that they tended to view the Native Americans as sort of like an animal species, the vocal cords, basically. That's kind of how they viewed the Native Americans and blacks as well. So that's important to consider. But the violence, though, that you see right from the start of the United States and its westward expansion is really extraordinary. I mentioned the Indian Exclusion Act earlier and the Trail of Tears. When the Indian Exclusion Act was passed, it actually went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court Justice John Marshall actually found it to be unconstitutional. And the president, Andrew Jackson, said, "Okay, Justice Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." Meaning, well, we're not going to pay any attention to what the court says because we've got the army, So it's business as usual. That essentially meant that the United States was functioning as a military dictatorship at the time. And it was a genocidal one. It was one that was literally exterminating whole nations during the course of the Western expansion.
Another point that I want to add to the development of the American military ethos is Lawrence Keeley in his excellent book War Before Civilization, where he completely obliterates the mythology of the peaceful prehistoric past. He makes an interesting observation that most tribal warfare, this would be between people of 100 to 500 people, combat on that level, is often total war. Men, women, and children are considered valid targets to be killed or captured or mutilated. And what happens is you'll have, in the United States, we saw this dichotomy. On the East Coast in the 1860s and 70s, a lot of the Easterners were sympathetic and developed the idea of the noble savage. But on the frontier, they had a more aggressive policy against them because they lived right up close with them. And not that American foreign policy or military ethos needed any spurring to be aggressive and violent, but the inherent nature of tribal warfare, of being a kind of like total war. Per capita death tolls are far higher in tribal conflicts, but the total population is much lower, so fewer people end up dying. But per capita, it's huge. I think at one point there's a massacre in the Great Plains where the Sioux exterminated their tribal enemies, the Cheyenne. Like 80% of the tribe was wiped out in that conflict. The Cheyenne tribe or something like that. It was the Pawnee tribe, my bad. Because the Pawnee later became U.S. Scouts, in part because the Sioux were beating up on them. So, not that we need any help, but the Indian method of fighting certainly fed that desire for an aggressive military confrontation.
Well, you can see parallels to that in the wars that took place between the Europeans and the native peoples in Latin America as well, with the Aztecs and so forth. The colonial wars that happened between, say, the Spanish and the Portuguese and some of the native civilizations in Latin America became that as well, but where it became a war of total extermination. The Europeans had kind of developed this method of warfare that was, like I said, it was more like a sporting event. I think a lot of that came out of the 30 Years' War. Because the 30 Years' War was so brutal and so deadly, there was a lot of.
For a lot of this period, the 17th to early 19th century, Europeans did not really try to engage in total warfare. The one exception being the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, and maybe the Crimean War to a lesser extent. But other than that, the battles were pretty small scale. Like, the 18th century was just rank and file formation, and this was probably this was the predominant form of European warfare until World War One, until 1914, the First World War. But from the Napoleonic Wars to World War One, and even before that, after the 30 Years' War, Europeans did not engage in this total warfare or total absolute, just massive high fatality rate battles. There were exceptions, but at least from the end of the Crimean War until World War One, the wars on Europe, within Europe, not outside of Europe, but in Europe, were very low scale. People tried to limit combatant fatalities as much as they could. There was a lot of strong emphasis on humanitarian or humane warfare, and basically limiting it to where it almost became like a sport. In early America, this was far from the case. Americans were very much bloodthirsty, expansionistic, and there was a lot of great scale battles, even before the Civil War. There was already very high fatality battles, like in the War of 1812, like in the Mexican-American War of the 1840s, like in the Texas Revolution. There were still some somewhat high fatalities. They were not anywhere close to the scale of the Civil War, but they were still pretty high scaled. And there was almost this entire, like, it was a sport to basically annihilate and genocide Indians, and this massive Indian annihilation wars. A lot of Civil War generals, both North and South, got a lot of experience from fighting in the Mexican War and fighting these different Indian wars. And that's where they learned how to deal with and how to scale up these very high mounting battles, was doing exactly this that was just described. But America expanded out westward very rapidly. Like almost every 20 years and then 10 years, America's population quadrupled because of high birth rates and immigration from Europe. America's population quadrupled every 20 or so years. And that was very important to help port out and supply into the Western territories a massive repopulation effort. And if you look at tribal warfare and the nature of tribal warfare, it is very, very brutal. Very inhumane and very brutal. There isn't a lot of high stakes because there's not a large number of tribespeople, but prehistoric warfare was very brutal and very bad. It was very extremely brutal. And the wars between these different Indian tribes and between Indians and Americans was extremely blood-stained and extremely brutal and with very high stakes. It was very brutal and just a very horrible experience. Lots of people were getting their scalped. Lots of people were getting scalped. Lots of people were getting hanged. Lots of people were getting flogged and raped. It was just a very hard and brutal thing. And not even with just Indians, but with Spaniards, with the British, Canadians, Mexicans, and pretty much everybody else. It was just a very violent thing. It was a century of dishonor. There's a terminology, it's the 1800s is known as the century of dishonor, or the age of dishonor in that regard. And this was occurring with the expulsion of the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Tecumseh, and the Creeks, and these other more civilized Indians and stuff. And then in the Jacksonian era, the Jacksonian age, when Andrew Jackson was president, there were the Indian expulsions. And some of these were the last expulsions of the Native Americans from east of the Mississippi River. And there was actually a case brought to the Supreme Court that said that the Indians had the right to stay on their tribal lands. Andrew Jackson completely ruled that out. He used and had the military and the army to back him. And he fought the Supreme Court, and he fought the Indians, and he got them expelled. Very few Native American tribes stayed east of the Mississippi River. There are Indian reserves east of the Mississippi, but you'll find that their numbers are far fewer than those west of the Mississippi. And it was due in a lot in part to Black Hawk's War, Tecumseh's War, the Creek War, and the Seminole Wars, and the Indian Expulsion Act, and all these other things. But America was very land hungry, and it had to be. Its population quadrupled every 20 or 10 years in the 19th century. And people were starving for land. They needed farmsteads. They needed to homestead land, and they needed to get land, and they could just go westwards and get it if they could stake and claim it for a certain number of years. As well as with mining, gold and silver and lint mining. Or lead mining.
Tribe or something like that. It was... No, sorry, it was the Pawnee tribe, my bad. Because the Pawnee later became U.S. Scouts, in part because the Sioux were beating up on them. So, not that we need any help, but the Indian method of fighting certainly fed that desire for an aggressive military confrontation. Tolls are far higher in tribal conflicts, but the total population is much lower, so fewer people end up dying. But per capita, it's huge. I mean, and I think at one point there's a massacre in the Great Plains where the Sioux exterminated their tribal enemies, the Cheyenne. Like 80% of the tribe was wiped out in that conflict. The Cheyenne tribe or something like that. It was... No, sorry, it was the Pawnee tribe, my bad. Because the Pawnee later became U.S. Scouts, in part because the Sioux were beating up on them. So, not that we need any help, but the Indian method of fighting certainly fed that desire for an aggressive military confrontation.
Well, you can see parallels to that in the wars that took place between the Europeans and the native peoples in Latin America as well, with the Aztecs and so forth. The colonial wars that happened between, say, the Spanish and the Portuguese and some of the native civilizations in Latin America became that as well, where it became a war of total extermination. The Europeans had kind of developed this method of warfare that was, like I said, it was more like a sporting event. I think a lot of that came out of the 30 Years' War. Because the 30 Years' War was so brutal and so deadly, there was a lot of aversion to large-scale warfare that came after that. First, the private war was outlawed. The making of war was ceded to the state, and even wars between states became sort of a sporting event for a time. And I think, though, that when the conquest of the New World started, I think it was a return to the kind of barbarian warfare that Europe had experienced in the past. It was more warfare the way the Romans did it, or the way the Germanic tribes did it, and it was probably in part influenced by the fact that you did have very brutal forms of warfare that existed already in the Western Hemisphere between the various indigenous nations and things like that. So and then the Europeans sort of blend into that when they start conquering the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah, I think the next major foreign policy interest is the War of 1812, or as they said, Mr. Madison's War back in the day.
Mr. Madison's War. I might actually stop here. I said I probably wouldn't watch this all the way through to the end, so, yeah, so real quickly, we did not have a very big military force. We had a lot of very land-hungry and very angry, hungry, and selfish settlers. And so, basically, Europe gave up these total wars of the ancient world and the Middle Ages, and started after the 30 Years' War and other religious fratricide wars to move away from that, to more civilized, sports-like rank-and-file warfare, or like limited scope warfare. That was not the case of the Americas. The Europeans like the Spaniards versus the Aztecs and the Incas, they fought a total war of annihilation, or just a very large scale total war. The Indian method of fighting was very harsh and very brutal, and the American army adopted this Indian method of fighting. Even in the colonial era, the European settlers that started with the very beginning of the colonization of the New World, and especially accelerating into the 18th and 19th centuries, very much engaged in a very violent and blood-stained struggle of survival. It was as much a war for survival itself and for existence as it was a war for land grabbing and survival. And the American military learned a lot from the Indians. They learned how to scout, they learned how to hunt, how to fish and plant, and they basically learned and mastered the Indian way of war, the Native American method and way of fighting a war. And by the time that the Civil War broke out in 1861, the Northern and the Southern armies had men who had fought in many of these Indian wars, and they knew how to fight. They were very tough, and they knew how to fight and how to survive in this method of warfare. So anyways, yeah, so basically America did not copy the European style or method of warfare. And by the mid-19th century, because there was no more Native Americans in the eastern seaboard, people on the eastern seaboard basically looked on with Indians with this fascination, absolute fascination of this otherworldliness, this kind of magical, mystical netherworldliness, kind of like how Europeans looked at gypsies and Chinese. Eastern seaboard Americans looked at Native Americans in that same way, whereas Americans on the frontier saw them as extremely hostile and extremely bloodthirsty and just hostile. You know, and the Indians likewise saw white American settlers in the same light. It was very racially motivated, very racial and very religiously motivated. But in the 19th century, before the rise of social Darwinism, there is a very strange, almost apathetic way of looking at Native Americans. It's very strange how people. I've always wondered how people in the Northeast could see African Americans as needing freedom and liberation and equality and equal rights and to be treated as equal, but they saw the Native Americans as basically subhuman. I've been trying to figure that out for a long time, but anyways, let's just continue. We're going into the War of 1812. Let's see if we can get some Canadian reactions.
The next major foreign policy interest is the War of 1812, or as they said, Mr. Madison's War back in the day. There were largely speaking, three groups in the American country by that point that exerted foreign policy influence, and that maintained itself for quite some time. You had the South, which at that point was controlled by the plantation owners. You had the North, which was controlled by the mercantilist classes, and then you had the West, which was controlled by essentially the populace. Now, in the War of 1812, the mercantilists in the North were very much against the war because they made trade with England. In fact, I think Massachusetts refused to raise levies or militias to go fight the war, and there was even the rumblings of secession from New England. Now, the West wanted war to get Canada. They assumed Canada would be a soft target. I guess they didn't learn the lesson from the American Revolution. It wasn't quite so soft. And the southern plantation owners were favorable to expansion southward into Mexico, into further west as well. And so the driving expansion domestically was from the west with the The West at that point would have been Ohio and Michigan, Illinois, and Indiana. And the South at that time would have been like, Virginia, Mississippi, Tennessee. And they would have been pushing for expansion to grow America's borders. Now, one of the things is the pretext was England had impressed U.S. sailors during the Napoleonic Wars in order to bolster their navy to help defeat the French and Napoleon. Now,
yeah, I was talking actually about this to Code of Truth, and he completely ignored me. Like, I talked about this to Drunken Surfer and Code of Truth, and they just flat out ignored what I said. It just didn't make any sense to me. But yeah, I'll get more into this in just a bit. Let's finish this up.
Tennessee, and they would have been pushing for expansion to grow America's borders. Now, one of the things is the pretext was England had impressed U.S. sailors during the Napoleonic Wars in order to bolster their navy to help defeat the French and Napoleon. Now, the funny thing is, the day that we declared war on the United Kingdom, or Great Britain rather, was when they had repealed the policy of kidnapping U.S. sailors, which really shows that it was more of a pretext than a real moral casus belli, because the British stopped doing it. But we wanted Canada. The Western Warhawks, Henry Clay being one of the leading advocates, believed that Canada could greatly expand. We just wanted land, really. Americans just wanted land. We didn't care where we got it from. And even to back it up, the Louisiana Purchase, where Jefferson bought land from France. The funny thing is, I think he had to violate the Constitution to actually do that, didn't he, Keith?
Yeah, well, there's nothing in the Constitution that authorized the purchase of massive territory at the cost of millions of dollars in 1803 money. I mean, it's interesting because if you go back and look at constitutional issues that came up during that time period, when James Madison was in Congress, someone wanted to appropriate some funds for the assistance to refugees or something like that. And Madison voted against it in Congress, saying, I can't really see where the Constitution authorizes this. But then Jefferson came along and appropriated $15 million in 1803 money, which would be probably hundreds of millions today, and for the purpose of buying this massive territory from the French. Which, I mean, it's very difficult to see how the Constitution would have allowed for that. At least as the Constitution was understood and interpreted at the time, the original Constitution. I mean, since then, constitutionalism has just come to mean whatever those in power wanted to mean. But I guess that was true back then as well too. But there was some idea back then. Well, the Constitution is the law of the land, and we need to go by it. And now that's not really the case. But
one more point I want to make about 1812. The Southern Hawks were encouraged to go to war because against Napoleon, Spain and England were allies, and they wanted to annex Florida. In part, I think because a lot of escaped slaves would flee to Florida into the bayous and marshes down there with the Seminole Indians, and they wanted to close that loophole up. So, being an ally of England, going after England could give them a pretext to going after Florida. And so the Western Warhawks and the Southern Warhawks were beating the war drums to go to war with England. And New England, making a lot of money, was like, we don't really want to go to war right now because we're making so much money with England. And that's kind of the lay of the land at the time that this happens. Was there anything you'd like to add to that description there, Keith?
Yeah, well, it is important to consider as well how important slave-owning interests were to the shaping of American policy in every area back then, not only foreign policy, but economics and lots of other things. It was only later that the big falling out happened between the North and the South over the issue of slavery and all the other issues that were.
Oh, did you just hear that, Alistair Mycroft? Did you just hear that, Alistair Mycroft? And Francis Day-esque? Oh, well, I guess that just proved that Alistair Mycroft and Francis Day-esque failed history class miserably, as well as every other class they had in public school. Just like they're failed people, they have non-interesting careers because they're just blue-collar workers. And somehow they think that they've got some kind of a moral, integral superiority over me. And they're blue-collar workers. They'll never be millionaires. Alistair Mycroft and Francis Day-Isk and Code of Truth and Drunken Surfer will never be millionaires. They'll never be white-collar workers, and somehow they think they got a superiority complex over me. I don't know where they got that from. And what's so funny is that they're all white, and they all have, like, white privilege. They have the same white privilege that I do, and somehow they think that they're more morally obligated than I am. You know, I call it for what it is. I call it BS. I call it complete BS from a blue-collar worker that thinks that they've got some kind of special moral superiority over yours truly. No, you don't. You absolutely don't. Okay? Most people that sit on the fence will agree with what you say almost as much as me. Okay? So, anyways, yeah, so we're talking about the War of 1812. So America's not really a united nation. The thing to understand is that the United States and Canada don't really have national identities. And this is something that Drunken Surfer and Code of Truth don't seem to understand, is that Canada did not exist. It was British America. It was just British occupied America. And yes, we did invade Canada. They also invaded the United States. Big deal. They also invaded Michigan. Canadian forces invaded the state of Michigan. They invaded upstate New York at the Battle of Buffalo in the War of 1812. Big deal. So the War of 1812 is just basically all the stuff that was carried over from the American Revolution, brought into the War of 1812. It's just, you know, I talked to Drunken Surfer and Code of Truth about the impressment of American sailors. Even during the Napoleonic Wars, the British still did not want to see America as a different nationality. They did not want to see Americans as a different nationality. They wanted to impress our sailormen because they were good sailors. We had good sailormen back then. Pai would be proud. They wanted to impress our sailors to go fight in the British Royal Navy with Canadians against the French. And at this time, Americans had no interest in fighting the French. We were not interested in fighting a European war. We were interested in expanding westwards. You know, yes, Napoleon Bonaparte was kind of a tyrant. No doubt about it. Napoleon Bonaparte was somewhat of a despot tyrant, but he was way more enlightened and way more humane and egalitarian than George III or Tsar Alexander I or the Prussian king or Joseph of Austria or any of those other absolute despots. Napoleon actually brought together the best ideas of the Renaissance and Enlightenment. He was very much a Renaissance man. He was very much an enlightened despot. He was just a good emperor overall, and he made France a great nation. Napoleon made France the paramount power of Europe. And all these other guys, especially the English, were jealous, absolutely jealous of the greatness of Napoleon Bonaparte. And they wanted to do everything they could to destroy anything good about European civilization. Let me tell you something about the British. The British are traitors. The Anglos are traitors to Europe, and they're traitors to Western civilization. Every time Europe has ever done anything truly great, the British have turned against Europe. They've tried to push this balance of power nonsense that was already outdated even back then, and they always killed the best of Europe. That's why Europe is in the situation it is today. It's because of Great Britain. The British are traitors to Europe. The British have always been traitors to Europe, and the British will always be traitors to Europe. And they've always tried to tyrannize us Americans too. They've always been tyrannical, narcissistic idiots. I have to be careful with the algorithms. So they were impressing our sailormen. They were impressing American sailors. And yes, the War of 1812 was declared on the very day that the British stopped the impressment, or the impressment of American sailors and other non-British Empire sailors. But that doesn't matter. But anyways, America was fueled with this hysteria about the British and the Canadians, and in the North and the Northeast there was the mercantile interests. Even then, New England was already going through bits of the early Industrial Revolution and manufacturing increasement. By the War of 1812, the mercantile societies and the merchant class completely dominated. The Brahmin class dominated New England. And actually, Massachusetts refused to organize and send its militia to fight the British and the Canadians. In the South, you had the planter class, and already by then, the slaveholding planter class was the dominant influence and predominant cultural force in the South. In the West, there was the war hawks. The Western states were the most fanatical to going to war with England in the War of 1812 because they wanted to invade Canada and invade Florida and Louisiana. Well, America already had Louisiana, and take that land. America was just very influenced with this westward expansion and just manifest destiny, and taking Florida and taking the Great Lakes regions of Michigan, and going into Ontario, Quebec, and Montreal, Labrador, and maybe perhaps even Manitoba, and like what would later be Manitoba, Alberta, and Saskatchewan, and just these unsettled territories. Now, that of course wasn't going to happen. We didn't have the military force that we later did. We didn't have the superior numbers and the superior military force that we later got later on. And so Drunken Surfer and Code of Truth need to realize that, in fact, they should be made up front to realize that fact, that America is superior to Canadians, and Americans are superior to Canadians, anytime, anywhere, period.
Assistance to refugees or something like that.
Oh
And
yeah, I
Madison
forgot about the
did it.
Louisiana Purchase. This is really unrelated, really, to this the War of 1812. But there was this thing called the Burr Conspiracy, and basically Andrew Burr wanted to go into Mexico or New Spain. I think it was still Spain. He wanted to raise up a republic and succeed from the Spanish Empire west of the Mississippi, and basically create in the Southwest a rival republic to the United States. And Thomas Jefferson was very concerned about this, and Thomas Jefferson actually created the Insurrection Act of 1803. And that was to prevent an insurrection by American settlers in the territory of New Spain, the Viceroyalty of New Spain, or the Spanish Empire. Now, Spain was long since in massive decline. The Latin American countries were about to break away and form their own republics in the French and American guise, and in the liberal, secular Enlightenment guise. But anyways, there is like these Haitian refugees, not Haitians like you might think, but these Francophone white people had fled from Haiti. They fled to New Orleans and to Savannah, Georgia, New Orleans, and other places, and the Americans welcomed them and accepted them in and made them citizens. There was a lot of refugees in this period. Religious and national refugees, refugees of revolution and counter-revolution, refugees of the wars with Napoleon and so forth at the time. And there was some refugees coming to America from Haiti, and there was attempts to raise money in Congress to help these refugees, and there was a whole crisis of the Constitution. You know, a big thing with the Republican Party is like a strong emphasis on the Constitution, and the Republican Party always overemphasizes the Constitution and thinks it's this invaluable document. The truth is it's not. It's not an invaluable document, it's nonsense. But regardless, Thomas Jefferson was able to get $15 million to give to France to buy Louisiana and Missouri and this large chunk of what is now the middle United States. Finally, America expanded all the way out to Missouri, all the way up through Iowa, and all the way up into basically almost Wyoming. Like, American territory finally extended from Florida all the way out to Nebraska, to Kansas, and all the way up into almost Wyoming. Not quite to Utah just yet, but certainly to Montana, Nebraska, North and South Dakota. All of that territory of the greater Mississippi and Missouri River Basin was now annexed. And Thomas Jefferson was able to get the funding for that without controversy because Americans wanted that land. And that 1803 Louisiana Purchase was the most important foreign policy win in American history in the 19th century, because it basically ensured that a European power would never dominate the North American continent. It ensured that that section of North America would become part of the United States. But anyways, we have the war hawks, and they're beating the drums. The Southerners and the Westerners are beating the drums because they want to expand slavery and slave-holding states westwards and southwards into Canada, into British and Spanish and Indian territory, and grow the population as much as they can. New England did not like this, and they talked about secession. And there was this thing called the Hartford Convention in 1815, and New England almost seceded from the Union. Basically, they didn't. It was stopped, but it almost happened. So there's already warfare between the abolitionist and the slave-holding class.
Was from the west, with the west at that point would have been Ohio and Michigan, Illinois, and Indiana, and the south at that time would have been like, Virginia, Mississippi, Tennessee, and
yeah. So at this point, like, what would be regarded as the west is going to be Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Minnesota, Illinois. The south, it would be Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Louisiana. We actually didn't have Florida yet. We got Florida from Spain later, with the Florida Treaty of 1820. But those would be the western states at the time. Those were the furthest western states that we had after the Louisiana Purchase. So the War of 1812 is basically an issue of impressment. And actually, Todd, when I get to World War I, the First World War, you're going to find out how a little bit hypocritical the American government was with how it dealt with the impressment of sailors in the War of 1812, only to turn a blind eye when the British did it in World War I. The British did the same thing in World War I, and you're going to see how the Americans turned an absolute blind eye to it when the Germans were doing it, or when the Germans were torpedoing U.S. merchant vessels on the high seas in World War I. But that's getting really ahead of ourselves. I mean, I'm just in the War of 1812 right now. So let's continue.
maintained itself for quite some time. You had the South, which at that point was controlled by the plantation owners. You had the North, which was controlled by the mercantilist classes, and then you had the West, which was controlled by essentially the populace. Now, in the War of 1812, the mercantilists in the North were very much against the war because they made trade with England. In fact, I think Massachusetts refused to raise levies or militias to go fight the war, and there was even the rumblings of secession from New England. Now, the West wanted war to get Canada. They assumed Canada would be a soft target. I guess they didn't learn the lesson from the American Revolution. It wasn't quite so soft. And the Southern plantation owners were favorable to expansion southward into Mexico, into further west as well. And so the driving expansion domestically was from the west, with the west at that point would have been Ohio and Michigan, Illinois, and Indiana, and the south at that time would have been like Virginia, Mississippi, Tennessee, and they would have been pushing for expansion to grow America's borders. Now, one of the things is the pretext was England had impressed U.S. sailors during the Napoleonic Wars in order to bolster their navy to help defeat the French and Napoleon. Now, the funny thing is, the day that we declared war on the United Kingdom, or Great Britain rather, was when they had repealed the policy of kidnapping U.S. sailors, which really shows that it was more of a pretext than than a real moral casus belli, because the British stopped doing it. But we wanted, I think we wanted Canada. The Western Warhawks, Henry Clay being one of the leading advocates, believed that Canada could greatly expand. We just wanted land, really. Americans just wanted land. We didn't care where we got it from. And even to back it up, the Louisiana Purchase, where Jefferson bought land from France. The funny thing is, I think he had to violate the Constitution to actually do that, didn't he, Keith?
Yeah, well, there's nothing in the Constitution that authorized the purchase of massive territory at the cost of millions of dollars in 1803 money. I mean, it's interesting because if you go back and look at constitutional issues that came up during that time period, when James Madison was in Congress, someone wanted to appropriate some funds for the assistance to refugees or something like that. And Madison voted against it in Congress, saying, I can't really see where the Constitution authorizes this. But then Jefferson came along and appropriated $15 million in 1803 money, which would be probably hundreds of millions today, and for the purpose of buying this massive territory from the French, which it's very difficult to see how the Constitution would have allowed for that. At least as the Constitution was understood and interpreted at the time, the original Constitution. Since then, constitutionalism has just come to mean whatever those in power wanted to mean. But I guess that was true back then as well too. But there was some idea back then. Well, the Constitution is the law of the land, and we need to go by it. And now that's not really the case. But
one more point I want to make about 1812. The Southern Hawks were encouraged to go to war because against Napoleon, Spain and England were allies, and they wanted to annex Florida. In part, I think because a lot of escaped slaves would flee to Florida into the bayous and marshes down there with the Seminole Indians, and they wanted to close that loophole up. So, being an ally of England, going after England could give them a pretext to going after Florida. And so the Western Warhawks and the Southern Warhawks were beating the war drums to go to war with England. And New England, making a lot of money, was like, we don't really want to go to war right now because we're making so much money with England. And that's kind of the lay of the land at the time that this happens. Was there anything you'd like to add to that description there, Keith?
Yeah, well, it is important to consider as well how important slave-owning interests were to the shaping of American policy in every area back then, not only foreign policy, but economics and lots of other things. It was only later that the big falling out happened between the North and the South over the issue of slavery and all the other issues that were implicit in that. The slave-holding interests were like the Fortune 500 corporations today. They were a major economic power. They had a great deal of representation in Congress and in the rest of the government. a lot of the leading military figures at the time came from the slave-owning states, and the northern states initially did not have the aversion to slavery that they came to have later. Like it was in the North that the abolitionist movement and all that developed, and some of the individual states actually threatened to secede over slavery and stuff like that in the North. But initially, though, the northern states were certainly willing to accommodate slavery, and they certainly had similar views on race. I mean, it was a massive.
Well, that's just a major L for Alistair Mycroft right there. And who was his buddy? Well, Alistair Mycroft just took a major L over that one. That's pretty pathetic too. That old Alistair Mycroft just took a big freaking F. I mean, a big freaking L. Who's the other guy too? Hold on a second. Who's this other guy? I don't remember his name, but I'll take a look right now. Surgeon to Ink Winson. So yeah, Surgeon to Ink Winson and Francis Dayesk and Alistair Mycroft, you took a big major L. Oh hey there, Code of Truth. You just took a big L in this stream. You might not have noticed, Code of Truth, but you and Drunken Surfer, you guys are Canadians, and you took a big freaking L. You took a big slap to the face with the American Revolution, and an even bigger punch to the face in the War of 1812. You and Drunken Surfer both did. But anyways, yeah, Alistair Mycroft and Jerk Winson, or Surgwin of Surgeon of Ink Winson, took a major L over Keith Preston. So yeah, ladies and gentlemen, the North was not always a hotbed of abolitionism. Okay, they fought in the American Revolution in part to profit over the slave trade. Great Britain was going to abolish the transatlantic slave trade. The New England the New England merchants did not want that. That's why they fought the American Revolution against Britain, so they could retain the transatlantic slave trade for another few years and profit and make money off of that. And I don't understand that. Anyways, and yeah, sorry, Code of Truth, I didn't literally mean that. It was just metaphorical. It was in Minecraft, and it was just completely metaphorical. I'm not literally actually going to physically do that. I don't advocate violence or nothing like that, but, I mean, this is pretty, violent. Like, American history in this period is rather violent. But, like, yes, the Western and the Southern Warhawks did want to invade and annex territories in Canada. But to be fair, there was only like 60 or 70,000 people in Canada at the time. There's only like a couple 100,000 people that lived in Canada. And there was like 10, 12 million Americans at the time. So like, but yeah, it was pretty stupid to think that we were going to invade British Canada in the War of 1812. It was a foolish thing to think that, because Canada was full of very pious, traditional Roman Catholic French Canadians and Irish, and Jacobites, Scottish Highlander Jacobites, and then American Loyalists, American Anglo-British American Tories. So obviously they did not want to have nothing to do with us, obviously. But we could take Florida. Yes, even in the War of 1812, Louisiana Purchase time period, we could have still taken Florida. And one of the things about the War of 1812 is that, yes, we wanted to expand slavery. We very much wanted, as a nation, to expand the slaveholding plantations into Florida and Alabama and Mississippi and Missouri and Louisiana and Tennessee and Kentucky. Very much we did. Very much so. and we also wanted to turn Florida into a slave territory and a slave state. And our slaves, the slaves were running away from the plantations and going into Florida, and the Spanish and the French. Spain was in alliance with France, and Spain controlled Florida at the time, and Andrew Jackson and some other guys wanted to invade and annex Florida. It was seen as a very profitable thing to do at the time. And eventually, we did not conquer Florida, but we bought it from Spain. And I don't mean our slaves, okay? I'm not talking about human property. But, I mean, let's just face it. America was a slaveholding society. And New England was going to succeed. New England did not want to fight the British or the Canadians. They did not want to organize their militias in New England or even in other northern states to fight the War of 1812. They wanted to be neutral. So here we have New England advocating for states' rights. They had already gotten rid of slavery by the War of 1812. All of the northern states got rid of slavery. It was just in the southern states at this point. So, but even though, like, the northern states were now free states, they were not really that troubled about slavery continuing in the southern states. It is a very big misconception that Yankees by nature were abolitionist. Almost up to just a handful of years before the Civil War, most Northerners were not anti-slavery, and most Southerners were not pro-slavery. Most Americans, North and South and West, really didn't care that much about it. It only was during the Civil War, and especially the expansion of slavery into Western territories and newly acquired territories after the Mexican War, that actually became an issue between the North and the South, and between the free states and the slave states, because it broke the Missouri Compromise. And a lot of people were very strong-minded about the Missouri Compromise of 1819, 1820. But anyways, let's just continue.
Had a great deal of representation in Congress and in the rest of the government.
But, yeah. Contrary to what Alistair Mycroft will tell you, and contrary to what Francis Deisque will tell you, and contrary to what Dark Ninja will tell you, and contrary to what Mormon Shaggy will tell you, the slave interests were very strong in the Supreme Court. There was actually a time when the plantation owners and the slaveholders had a majority in the U.S. Senate and almost an entire majority in the U.S. Congress. And there was also a time when Southern plantation owners ran the Supreme Court. But Ghost of Cletus, or Ghost of Niccolo, I don't know what his name is now, but Ghost of Niccolo, either he doesn't understand, or Ghost of Niccolo is fulfilling a Freemasonic agenda himself, and is himself a Freemason in disguise, will deny the fact that Southerners used the federal government to enforce the Slave Escape Act of 1850, or the Slavery, the Escaped Refugee Slave Act of 1850 and 1792. Ghost of Niccolo, either because he is misinformed or because he is a Freemason, will actually deny that the federal government intervened to the interest of the Southern slaveholders. So contrary to what Ghost of Cletus or Ghost of Niccolo, who might in fact be a underground secret Freemason himself and might be pushing a Freemasonic agenda, will deny that the federal government actually captured runaway slaves and took them back south, and that Southerners actually used the power of the federal government, which is anti-states' rights, by the way, to not give citizenship to blacks if they go to a free state, like in the Dred Scott decision, or to capture runaway slaves in the North and take them back to a slaveholding state, or deny them based on race, on their racial profile, the right of citizenship in a free state. This is something that Ghost of Niccolo or Ghost of Cletus himself denies, and he is either misinformed or he might be pushing a crypto-Freemason agenda himself. He might actually be a crypto-Freemason and he is pushing a Freemasonic agenda.
The big falling out happened between the North and the South over the issue of slavery and all the other issues that were implicit in that. The slave-holding interests were like the Fortune 500 corporations today. I mean, they were a major economic power. They had a great deal of representation in Congress and in the rest of the government. A lot of the leading military figures of the time came from the slave-owning states, and the northern states initially did not have the aversion to slavery that they came to have later. Like it was in the North that the abolitionist movement and all that developed, and some of the individual states actually threatened to secede over slavery and stuff like that in the North. But initially, though, the northern states were certainly willing to accommodate slavery, and they certainly had similar views on race. I mean, there was a massive discrimination against, say, blacks or anyone else in the northern states as well. So it's important to remember how important slave owning interests were to the formulation of policy in every area back then. And preventing slaves from escaping or curbing any possibility of an insurrection or revolt by slaves was also a major consideration whenever any kind of issues came up.
Yeah, exactly. But what do you agree with a sort of like tripartite regional division of policy interests?
Yeah, well, I mean, we see that even at later points in U.S. politics as well. We've always seen something of a maybe not so much nowadays, perhaps, but for a long time, we always saw a very strong division between the North, South, and the West in domestic U.S. politics. Nowadays, the American nation tends to be more integrated, even if it's very divided in an ideological sense. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's certainly true that the North was dominated by merchants, the South by agricultural interests, and the North, the West by territorial expansionism. And it's always been in the Western states, for example, that this kind of American populist tradition has emerged. You have that coming along even in the 20th century. You see this kind of Western populism that's rooted in this kind of Marlboro country frontier concept. You have aspects of that today that are remnants of that. Like one example of these sovereign citizen groups. These sovereign citizen groups that believe that driver's license requirements are just a horrible abridgment of individual liberty. That's the legacy of our having once been a frontier society, and in particular the culture that was developed during in the Western states. That's where all of that stems from.
Yeah, exactly. One of this is not directly a part of the United States, but is very important aspect of U.S. foreign policy is the Mexican and then later Texan revolutions. So in the 18, I think.
All right. So, anyways, America has traditionally been divided into three regions. The North was always dominated by merchant interests. The South dominated historically by a planter class, a planter society, and the West by this very militantly expansionist and very racist mentality. So that's why even today, like Western states, there's more like a historical legacy of racism than the Eastern states typically are. But yeah, the North was very complicit in the expansion of Southern slaveholding, and the North did a lot of compromising to it. Henry Clay is a good example. Although actually he was from Kentucky, which is a slave state. But like Webster Noah and Henry Clay were friends. And there was like people like John C. Calhoun, South Carolina, Noah Webster, Massachusetts, and Henry Clay, Kentucky. They kind of represent like these different tripartite phases of antebellum Jacksonian America. Jacksonian America might very well have been the apex of early American democracy. I mean, like, pretty much anyone who was a white, straight, cis male who owned some land and paid the poll tax could basically, and also his taxes, could become president. It was actually really that democratic. America, well, Lincolnian and Wilsonian America was more democratic than Jacksonian America, but I mean, this is not that far from the American Revolution. You know, we're in the formative years of the 19th century, and America is already bigger than most Western European countries are. It's like 10 times the size of France in the 1830s. But anyways, regardless of the North and South compromise and friendship, abolitionism is going to grow in the South, and a very strong slave-holding planter society and pro-slavery is going to grow in the South. And the Western states just really ignore it and just focus more on expansion, and just feel that as long as more land is grabbed, it'll perturb and perhaps even solve the issue of the North and South rivalry, but ultimately it doesn't. Now, finally, we're going to get into the Texas Revolution, and I think they're going to talk a bit about the Mexican War. So we're getting into that now.
That's the legacy of our having once been a frontier
Oh
society.
yeah. So in the United States, there's this thing called the sovereign citizen movement. They're basically guys that believe that their rights, their natural freeborn rights, they don't have to drive with a license, and they don't need a license to shoot a gun, and they don't. This Keith Preston is saying that that's a legacy of America once being a frontier society, and it's true. It's pretty much true.
And in particular, the culture that was developed during the in the Western states. That's where all of that stems from.
Yeah, exactly. One of the this is not directly a part of the United States, but is a very important aspect of U.S. foreign policy is the Mexican and then later Texan revolutions. So in the 1810s, during the Napoleonic Wars, leading into the 1820s, Mexico fights for independence against Spain. Spain being occupied by France is hardly capable of offering much resistance, and as do many other countries in Latin America at the time. And Mexico gains all of the land that is today, of course, Mexico, and then north of the Rio Grande, including places like California, Nevada, Texas, Oklahoma, Utah. And in the 1930s, 20s, and 30s, the funny thing is we talk about Mexican illegal immigrants today, but the quote-unquote first illegal immigrants were Western frontiersmen settlers trickling into Texas to make their fortune. And they became eventually a very influential component within Texas itself, to such a point where they then revolted against Mexico to gain their independence. Now, shortly thereafter, they filed for statehood. So one wonders, was this a sort of an American attempt to subvert a neighboring country and take away one of its provinces? And then of course in the national mythology we have the Alamo, where which ultimately led to these pretexts ultimately led to the war with Mexico. that would take place and strip them of all the lands, most of the lands north of the Rio Grande. But with the Travis and Bowie and Crockett all dying at the Alamo, it was a great sort of a Thermopylae moment for America, right? The few outnumbered, bravely holding out against overwhelming odds. But that sort of Western frontier expansion, when they started to trickle in the trappers and the hunters and the people just trying to make their own fortune any way they could. When enough of the Anglos came into Texas, they then revolted against the Mexicans, and that, of course, fed into American expansionism. And the South and the West converged on Mexico and Texas as a similar goal because they both saw as advancing their interests. Texas could be a new slave state, and the Western expansionists would just get more land for the great American experiment.
Yeah, and it's interesting to note how many people today have no idea that Texas was once an independent nation. I'm always amazed at a number of Americans who have no clue that that's the case. But it is interesting though because one argument that the left constantly raises is, well, when people complain about immigration today, don't they understand that that whole southwest region was actually once Mexican territory, and the way that it became part of and with Texas being an independent nation at one point, but the way it became part of the United States was largely through annexation. And they kind of have a point with that. In fact, I know I had a British nationalist tell me once. He says, I don't even understand how Americans can be opposed to immigration if you look at their history. But yeah, which is an interesting take on it. I think one that has some accuracy. But what we simply see the Americans doing is annexing one sovereign nation after another. I mean, the Americans achieved their independence.
Okay, so I don't think I really have enough time to cover the Texas Revolution 1835 to 1836. So the whole pretext of that is just basically everything going back to the Pilgrim Fathers and the settling of Massachusetts Bay Colony and Jamestown in Virginia. I mean, it's the same Puritan-minded, racist kind of American mentality that I've been talking about this entire time. But anyways, so Spain was invaded in 1806 by France, and Napoleon Bonaparte put his brother Josephine Bonaparte, on the throne of Spain. And all across the Spanish Empire, they refused to accept a French Bonaparte as the King of Spain. And they were called Legitimists. And particularly in the Viceroyalty of New Spain, they started to revolt, and Father Hidalgo, a Catholic priest, incited a rebellion and eventually a revolution. Became the Mexican Revolution or the Mexican War of Independence, 1810 to 1823. And some battles were fought in Texas. Some of these battles were fought in Texas and California. But in 1821, Mexico declared independence from Spain. And Mexico had Texas, it had Arizona, New Mexico, California, Utah, Nevada. It had all those states and territories. And of course, the Western war hawks, fur trappers, and southern plantation slaveholders wanted that land. And again, it was Anglo-American. So, contrary to what Ghost of Cletus falsely, because Ghost of Cletus bears false witness, and he bears a sin on his hands when he says that the Germans and the Irish were involved in the colonization of Texas. They were to an extent, but at a much later date. It was mostly Protestant Anglo-Americans and Protestant Scotch Ulster Scots who settled and colonized Texas, and then subsequently, when they had enough numbers, these Protestants broke away. So Code of Truth was asking me some questions about the Protestants in the American Revolution and their visceral hatred of Roman Catholics, and there was some of that, but what I was able to look up is that there was Roman Catholics in the American Revolution. The Texas Revolution is completely different. It very much was a Protestant Anglo prejudice, and this is something that Ghost of Cletus or Ghost of Niccolo is either confused or is pushing a prejudiced agenda in regards to Roman Catholics about with the Texas Revolution. But anyways, the Protestants in Texas were very prejudiced to Roman Catholics in Texas. And maybe it was because the Mexican government wanted the Texans to convert to Roman Catholicism. They did not want to convert, and they wanted to have slavery, and slavery had been banned in Mexican Cuhahuala and Tejas, and they wanted to reinstate this to reinstate slavery. So regardless, the Protestant Anglo-Celtic Americans rebelled. The Americans revolted, and they pushed a very Protestant agenda. And Texas had a revolution. There is the Battle of the Alamo, the Battle of Gallaudet, and other things. And some Roman Catholic Tejanos fought on the side of the rebels. So that's an aspect that Dark Ninja is either misinformed about, or he is pushing a underground Freemasonic agenda. Dark Ninja might be a crypto Freemason, and he might be pushing a Freemasonic agenda with trying to lie about the participation of Roman Catholic Tejanos in the Texas War of Independence. But regardless of that, the Texas Revolution, Texas breaks away from Mexico, as does the Republic of the Yucatan and the Republic of the Rio Grande. California almost also succeeds and become a republic as well. The Californians almost leave Mexico too. But anyways, the Republic of Texas was an independent nation from 1836 to 1845. And during this time, the Texas Protestants were extremely prejudiced towards the Tejanos and to the Irish and the Germans who were Roman Catholic. The Texas government was extremely prejudiced and extremely visceral towards Roman Catholics and enacted laws of discrimination against Roman Catholics. So there was a very discriminating factor in regards to that I wanted to point out since we're talking about this. But anyways, in 1845, through a conventional plebiscite or a conventional mandate, an act is passed to where the Republic of Texas joins the United States. And there is already very big division about it because it's felt that it is a desecration to the synchronicity of the Constitution. The North does not want or did not want Texas to join the Union because it would become a slave state. It would expand slavery, and it would also go against the Missouri Compromise of 1820. So the North did not want Texas to join the Union. The South did because they wanted another slave state, and they wanted more representatives in the Senate and the House of Representatives. So they very much favored Texan annexation.
And they kind of have a point with that. In fact, I know I have a pretty.
Oh yeah. In regards to illegal Mexican immigration, it's often forgotten on the part of Americans that they were illegals in Mexican Tejas. There is a time when American illegal immigrants invaded Mexican Tejas and took Roman Catholic Tejano land and annexed it into a Protestant republic and then into the Protestant United States.
Came into Texas, they then revolted against the Mexicans, and then, of course, fed into American expansionism. And the South and the West converged on Mexico and Texas as a similar goal because they both saw as advancing their interests. Texas could be a new slave state, and the Western expansionists would just get more land for the great American experiment.
Yeah, and it's interesting to note how many people today have no idea that Texas was once an independent nation. I'm always amazed at a number of Americans who have no clue that that's the case. But it is interesting though, because one argument that the left constantly raises is, well, when people complain about immigration today, don't they understand that that whole southwest region was actually once Mexican territory, and the way that it became part of, and with Texas being an independent nation at one point, but the way it became part of the United States was largely through annexation. And they kind of have a point with that. In fact, I know I had a British nationalist tell me once. He says, I don't even understand how Americans can be opposed to immigration if you look at their history. Uh, but
Because they come in and they take our jobs and they raise the crime a bit. That's why a lot of Americans do not like illegal immigration, because it brings in MS-13 and a bunch of illegal criminal syndicates from Latin America, especially Colombia and Venezuela, Costa Rica and Guatemala and so forth. So, like, America welcomes immigrants, but they do not welcome that. So that's one of the reasons why.
yeah, which is an interesting take on it. I think one that has some accuracy. But what we simply see the Americans doing is annexing one sovereign nation after another. I mean, the Americans achieved their independence for the colonies. They attempted to, as you pointed out, they tried to annex Canada. They did successfully conquer a range of Native American nations. They annexed Texas. Of course, they later expanded into Hawaii and all of that as well. Vermont was once an independent nation that was incorporated into the United States as well. So we see right from the start this kind of effort to essentially gobble up this whole North American continent and incorporate it into this American empire. I think in some ways, perhaps it can be American expansionism in the 19th century could be compared to Napoleon, to the Napoleonic Wars, which were all about building this French empire that was supposedly bringing the Enlightenment to Europe. That's largely what the rationale behind the Napoleonic Wars were. And I think that all of this is really just the American version of the Napoleonic Wars. I mean, the United States and France both had this kind of Enlightenment influenced, almost messianic ideology, certainly a revolutionary ideology, and it was all about expanding it to these backward people on the rest of the continent, in North America for the Americans, and in Europe for the French.
Yeah, that's actually a very good point. I never really looked at it that way, but you can easily see how America, after the French Revolution, did consider France a sister republic. And Jefferson specifically did so. That's why he wasn't really too happy with the whole quasi-war thing. He said, we should be on the same side here. But yeah, it really is quite brutal when you look at how we just subjugate all these sovereign states around us. One of the interesting things is Florida, when in I think it was 1821 period, Jackson ended up buying Florida from the Spanish. But the Seminole tribe of Indians that lived in Florida, and because of its inaccessible marshlands, a lot of not just escaped slaves, but just people that were on the bottom of the social ladder would try to escape into the Florida. And there was a lot of racial mixing, and the Seminoles were an important force there. And the United States 3 times tried to bring the Seminoles to heel, and each time the Seminoles were able to fight the U.S. government to a standstill, and were the only state, the only Indian tribe in the United States that did not have to sign a horribly unequal treaty that stripped them of their lands and their rights. And it's also interesting that William Tecumseh Sherman, who would become infamous later on, cut his teeth against the Seminoles. And one of his conclusions he drew from fighting the Seminoles was the way that you beat them is you just have to round them up and kill them all.
Yeah, well, a lot of the tactics that were used during the American Civil War were derivative of what had been used during the Indian Wars previously. As you pointed out, a lot of the generals in the Union Army were after the U.S. Civil War, the next step for the Union Army was to continue these kinds of attacks on the Native American nations further to the west. The history of Florida that you mentioned is interesting as well. You know, Florida really was sort of I guess you could call a vagabond territory or something like that. It was sort of a refuge for all sorts of folks that were escaping the influence of the dominant American civilization. It was kind of almost like the Zamia region of Southeast Asia or something. This kind of primitive area where you had all of these people that were from the bottom of the social ladder congregating. I don't know that a whole lot of research has been done on that history, but it is an interesting time period. The back to what I was saying earlier about the relationship between the French and the Americans, it really is, I think, an issue important to recognize that the American Revolution and the French Revolution were really variations of the same impulse. This was the Enlightenment coming to power, and there are some American-style conservatives, that is, people who want to be conservatives on one hand, but they want to be American nationalists on the other hand, that try to deny this in a way that I think is really strange. Russell Kirk was a great example. Russell Kirk always tried to say that.
So was Rushdoony too.
What was who?
That was Rushdoony. He also wanted to claim that American Revolution was a conservative movement.
Yeah, I suspect he probably lifted some of his ideas from Russell Kirk, because Russell Kirk was the one that really tried to popularize this idea. But there are some American-style conservatives, different types, who have.
Yeah, so there's this tradition of American conservatives that they basically say that the American Revolution was a good war, that it was a necessary war, and to some degree it was. I don't think that Americans, or even Canadians, were going to ever coexist with Britain. Like, you have a country the size of Canada or the United States, and it's being ruled by an island country, the United Kingdom. And it's not going to work. Like, eventually the paths will diverge. And that's exactly what happened in the American colonies. Even though the population was tremendously smaller than in Britain, the land was huge. It was a continent apart, and the people were going to diverge and go their own way. The American Revolution was an inevitability. 100,000 people died in the Revolutionary War, and about 10 to 20,000 people died in the War of 1812. It was not a morally just war, but it was just a war that was necessary for the foundations of the United States. It was a necessary war, but it was not a merciful or a very Christian war. It was an Enlightenment war. It was a war of the Enlightenment era. It was a bourgeoisie revolution. I don't know how else to put it. It was a bourgeoisie revolution. It was a middle-class, artisan, mercantile, pirate revolution. It was a revolution of pirates, farmers, planters, mercantilists, mechanists, middle-class people who did not want an aristocratic order. And they were right. But to say that it was not based on religious fanaticism and racism is fundamentally wrong. It very much was an expansionistic and religiously motivated conflict that was based upon the ideas of the Protestant Reformation and the Enlightenment of the 18th century. The American and the French revolutions were two variations of the same thing. They both came out of the same exact order of the period. The American and the French revolutions were sister revolutions. And in some ways, the Glorious Revolution and the American Revolution were sister revolutions. And Thomas Paine said that the United States and the Republic of France were sister republics in the 1790s. And our wars of Western expansion our wars of expansionism out west is in many ways comparable with the Jacobin reign of terror in France and the Napoleonic Wars against the different European monarchies. Even though Napoleon became an emperor, he was a proconsul and then he was an emperor. And even though France became something of an Enlightenment autocracy, it still fought the absolute autocracies in Europe. And France went about annexing and taking land and territory in Western Europe and in Central and Southern Europe, into Germany, Italy, and Spain, and Holland. And America did the same exact thing that Napoleonic and revolutionary France did at the same time. It was the same exact mentality, the same exact push for land between the French Republic and the French Empire and the United States. And then, of course, the Seminoles were the last Indians east of the Mississippi to be crushed. The Seminoles could, in a way, the Seminoles could be actually praised for never having signed a treaty until 1938 with the United States government. And even though the Seminoles were defeated in the 1850s in the Fourth or the Fifth Seminole War, they didn't sign an official treaty until 1938 or 1937. That's kind of impressive. But anyways, I guess we should continue.
Important to recognize that the American Revolution and the French Revolution were really variations of the same empire.
Oh yeah, and then Florida was basically a refugee place. Like Florida was this semi-civilized but actually very uncivilized backwater, and like a lot of pirates. It was a haven for pirates, like pirates and escaped slaves and Seminole Indians. Very, very tough Native American resistance fighters and escaped slaves and white people that basically run away to escape their debts and debt runners and pirates, and it was pretty interesting. But that's actually some of the history of Florida. That was also one of the reasons why the American federal government wanted to annex Florida from Spain too, was because of the issue of escaped slaves and piracy and hostile Indian tribes.
Inaccessible marshlands. A lot of not just escaped slaves, but just people that were on the bottom of the social ladder would try to escape into the Florida, and there was a lot of racial mixing, and the Seminoles were an important force there. And the United States 3 times tried to bring the Seminoles to heel, and each time the Seminoles were able to fight the U.S. government to a standstill, and were the only Indian tribe in the United States that did not have to sign a horribly unequal treaty that stripped them of their lands and their rights. And it's also interesting that William Tecumseh Sherman, who would become infamous later on, cut his teeth against the Seminoles. And one of his conclusions he drew from fighting the Seminoles was the way that you beat them is you just have to round them up and kill them all.
Yeah, well, a lot of the tactics that were used during the American Civil War were derivative of what had been used during the Indian Wars previously. As you pointed out, a lot of the generals in the Union Army were, in fact, generals that had cut their teeth fighting in these Indian Wars before the U.S. Civil War. In fact, after the U.S. Civil War, the next step for the Union Army was to continue these kinds of attacks on the Native American nations further to the west. The history of Florida that you mentioned is interesting as well. Florida really was sort of I guess you could call a vagabond territory or something like that. It was sort of a refuge for all sorts of folks that were escaping the influence of the dominant American civilization. It was kind of almost like the Zamia region of Southeast Asia or something. This kind of primitive area where you had all of these people that were from the bottom of the social ladder congregating. I don't know that a whole lot of research has been done on that history, but it is an interesting time period. The back to what I was saying earlier about the relationship between the French and the Americans, it really is, I think, an issue important to recognize that the American Revolution and the French Revolution were really variations of the same impulse. This was the Enlightenment coming to power, and there are some American-style conservatives, that is, people who want to be conservatives on one hand, but they want to be American nationalists on the other hand, that try to deny this in a way that I think is really strange. Russell Kirk was a great example. Russell Kirk always tried to say that.
So was Rushdoony too.
What was who?
That was Rushdoony. He also wanted to claim that American Revolution was a conservative movement.
Yeah, I suspect he probably lifted some of his ideas from Russell Kirk because Russell Kirk was the one who really tried to popularize this idea. But the idea but there are some American style conservatives of different type who have tried to claim, well, the American Revolution was not a revolution; it was actually a conservative counter-revolution against liberal England or something like that, which is about as bizarre, about as bizarre as it comes. I mean, how anybody could read the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution and the Federalist Papers, not to mention the personal papers of the first generation of American leaders, and come to that kind of conclusion is just really as bizarre as it gets. I mean, that's clearly the case of somebody bending historical facts to get the idiom.
That's actually a very interesting theory about the American Revolution. Apparently, even in the 18th century, Great Britain was already extremely liberal. Like, it was already the leading liberal country in the world. And in some respects it was. And in other respects, not so much. So, Russell Kirk said that the American Revolution of 1775 was actually a counter-revolution against the intransigent liberalism that was predominating in Britain. I mean, I don't know how you get that around to wanting to get rid of the aristocratic royalist order in the colonies and just the urge to get rid of aristocracy and royalism and Toryism out of the American states, but okay. That's an interesting theory. I actually want to investigate some more on that, but it's really off topic with this one.
Revolution. It was actually a conservative counter-revolution against liberal England or something like that, which is about as bizarre, about as bizarre as it comes. I mean, how anybody could read the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution and the Federalist Papers, not to mention the personal papers of the first generation of American leaders, and come to that kind of conclusion is just really as bizarre as it gets. I mean, that's clearly the case of somebody bending historical facts to get the ideological conclusion they want.
I think one interesting point to hit on that we need to maybe expand a little bit more is the Trail of Tears. One of the things I think that's very illustrative of the Trail of Tears is the Native Americans were sort of offered, sort of like two, kind of like the image we have of Islam, convert or die. The Native Americans were kind of given two options: either accept American Enlightenment culture and you live, or if you don't, we'll just kill you. It's kind of an Islamic mentality of convert or die. No, the tribes that were expelled from Georgia during the Trail of Tears, the Cherokee, the Muskogee, the Seminole, the Chickasaw, and the Choctaw, all of them had more or less modernized into Americans. They had printing presses, they owned slaves, they had their own constitution. They had really adopted American political culture. And even that wasn't enough to protect them. The other tribes that kept to their ancestral ways, you could say, well, the convert or die, the Islamic fatwa, that we issued them, they just weren't going to go. But it showed that even giving into American culture, even accepting their principles, their technology, wasn't going to make you, you're still a target. You weren't safe.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's very similar to Bolshevism. With these communist states of the 20th century, I mean, they would wage war against rival socialists, against other communist states that didn't meet their standards. That was that's something that was continued for 200 years now, and it's interesting to see how all of that has its prototypes in stuff that came out of the late 18th and early 19th century. It really is this kind of enforcing this kind of ideological conformity and in a way that's used for the purpose of masking just old-fashioned imperialist ambition.
Yeah, exactly. I think probably the most important thing to take away is that.
Okay, so the Trail of Tears was already something that I talked about in regards to the Indian exclusion or expulsions of 1830. This is like hundreds and thousands of people being expelled, and there is a influenza or syphilis epidemic among these tribes when they were forced to go westwards to Oklahoma. So Andrew Jackson expelled the Cherokee, the Muskogee, the Creeks, Chickasaw, and the Choctaw Indians. And it's crazy because they were already very well adapted to a settled and civilized lifestyle. They had printing presses, they owned slaves. They were basically civilized Southerners. They spoke English. They were Protestant. They went to church. They were all Christian. They had adapted the Southern Anglo-American Protestant lifestyle very well, and they were still marks. They were still kicked out. And, you know, this is something that Southern Israelite and Code of Cletus deny. Like, Code of Cletus and Southern Israelite hate these people. And they were Southerners. Like, these people were very good Southerners, and Southern Israelite and Code of Cletus hates these people, despises these people, and they're Southerners. And it's like, you know, if Code of Cletus and Southern Israelite don't even want these people, why in the world would they want autistic people to be Southerners? You know, if it could happen to the Cherokee, why would it not happen to Asperger's people who are not disabled? If it could happen to the Cherokee and to the 5 civilized nations, why would it not happen to a neurodivergent people? You know, but understandable, it was just a part of just the American way of life. America was an Enlightenment-based Protestant racial society, very racial, but also very centrally Enlightenment-based society. Like, France and America were sister nations at this point in time. Not so much now, but back then, that was very important. But, yeah, I do not think that the American Revolution was... It had some conservative aspects to it, insofar as the Puritan influence, but only because of the Calvinist influence. If it hadn't been for the Calvinist or Calvinism and the Puritans and stuff and the Protestantism, it would have been more like the French Revolution without a doubt. America was very hostile to the Native American tribes, very hostile to the black slaves, and very hostile to even to Europeans and even to other Americans, because, you know, as we march on through this, we're going to have a war where Americans kill other Americans. You know, so is that really what a God-sent nation would do? Kill each other in a civil war?
States that didn't meet their standards. That was a, you know,
All of them had more or less.
Clearly the case of somebody bending historical facts to get the ideological conclusion they want.
I think one interesting point to hit on that we need to.
Yeah, I think there's kind of a big amnesia in regards to this time period. Especially with the American Revolution, there's just a lot of just mind bending, like just this almost Jedi mind tricks in regards to that revolution. Every excuse is possible to, like, say it was not a radical revolution when actually was a radical revolution, and a very deadly war for the time period at that. Lots of Native Americans were killed in the American Revolution, and there's just no way to go around that fact.
The Islamic fatwa, that we issued them, they just weren't going to go. But it showed that even giving into American.
I would say that it was more of a Protestant fatwa than an Islamic one. It was more of a Christian fatwa. But yes.
Culture.
Oh, and by the way, slip of tongue about when I said our slaves, I meant their slaves. I do apologize. Look, I'll cover this more in the Civil War, but yeah, I mean, slavery was bad. But isn't that just an aspect of the inequality, of the inherent inequality of civilization itself? But anyways, the federal government was pro-slavery. The federal government that supposedly fights for human equality. For the first 85 years of the existence of the federal government, black people were 3/5 of a person. Well, actually, no, they were 2/5 of a person. Black people were considered 2/5 of a person.
Even accepting their principles, their technology, wasn't going to make you. You're still a target. You weren't safe.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's very similar to Bolshevism. With these communist states of the 20th century, I mean, they would wage war against rival socialists, against other communist states that didn't meet their standards. That was that's something that was continued for 200 years now, and it's interesting to see how all of that has its prototypes in stuff that came out of the late 18th and early 19th century. It really is this kind of enforcing this kind of ideological conformity, and in a way that's used for the purpose of masking just old-fashioned imperialist ambition.
Yeah, exactly. I think probably the most important thing to take away is that modern day liberalism, in its view of the state, is the way the narrative typically goes is we have these nasty wars of religion when these, simple-minded, stupid religious people were killing each other over, the was the body and blood of Christ, was it in the Eucharist or not? And then we have these, enlightened liberals that came along and said, no, let's just take religion out of politics. And then the liberal state will be this neutral umpire that mediates fairly, quote unquote, between these other competing interests. And that we're not violent. We bring peace. We are the peacemakers. But as we just pointed out with the French and American revolutions, when this system of government was birthed, it was birthed in a Holocaust. I mean that's probably not too hyperbolic at all. Look at the Napoleonic Wars and then the American westward expansion. The liberal state was born in a Holocaust, and it totally undercuts its pretext of being a peacemaker.
Yeah, and of course the rationale behind it is, well, they weren't as enlightened as we were. We couldn't help it because to have peace we had to have war. And again, that's a method of thinking that permeates liberal thought, even today. But if we look at the 20th century again, World War One, the war to end all wars, that's how this kind of thinking seems to work. It's always about peace and justice and things like that. But there's always somebody that's benighted, that's in the way, and keeping everything from working the way it should be. So we've got to get rid of them.
Yeah. So I think we're about out of time now. Is there anything you want to leave us with before we go?
Um, just that it is interesting to consider how violent American imperialism was, even in the early period of the United States. There's this common image that um, that a lot of people have, that the United States early on was sort of like this peaceful, almost libertarian-like republic. A lot of libertarians hold to this mythology. Even a lot of traditional conservatives, some leftists even hold to this kind of mythology. And then everything started going south over time as there was the United United States evolved into an empire and things of this nature. But I think that if we really look at the actual history there, we see that essentially what happened in the late 18th and early 19th century was just a full-blown tribal warfare between the Americans and between the English Americans and between the Native Americans, and that in turn really set the precedent for what the American empire would become. It's always been an empire of expansionism and subjugation and domination.
Yeah, exactly. We were the first Jacobins.
Right.
But yeah, this is Todd Lewis signing off.
Yeah, I don't think. I do disagree about the Jacobin. I would say that we were the first Girondins. I would say that we were the first Girondins. But yeah, I mean, but anyways, the Jacobin influence will come in with the Civil War. The Jacobin stuff will come in very much with the Civil War. But yeah, I mean, America and France are sister republics without a doubt, or at least we were in this time period. Americans and Frenchmen probably would not today, say that, but at this time they would have, for sure. But there is the liberals are delusional. Like, liberals are very deluded, and libertarians are not free thinkers, okay? This idea that we were fighting these religious wars over the Eucharist, and what came out of the Eucharist, and they were horrible wars, and then these Enlightenment free thinkers came along, and they fought these wars of revolution and Enlightenment and classical liberalism, and they were actually the peacemakers. They were the good guys. This is false. This is nonsense. World War I is a very good example of the shortcomings of this mentality. World War I was the death knell of this kind of high-minded, high and free-spirited liberalism that came out of the Enlightenment. And just look at what came after World War I. But look at what came out of the American and French revolutions, for goodness sake. Look what came out of the Texas Revolution. The same impulse. The exact same impulse. World War I is a very good case study, and so is World War II, because the liberals fought side by side with the communists. And it's like the Soviet Union invaded and attacked other communist countries. Alistair Mycroft and whoever the hell his buddy is, that freaking Sergon Cuck Winstan guy that follows him on his videos, they're deluded. They're delusional. They only see and judge chess by 2D. They don't see how 4D chess works. They don't understand 5-dimensional chess. They don't see that communist countries invaded and rampaged other communist countries. That liberal countries invaded, terrorized, and took land from other liberal countries. And I find this to be absolutely insane. This is why I don't vote for the Republicans or for the Democrats, or for the Libertarians, or for the Greens, or any of them. They're all fulfilling a state indoctrinational agenda. It's an agenda of social engineering that is driven by the technocrats, by the technocratic class, by the 1% class that rules over Wall Street. It's that simple. And I'm not a communist or a Marxist for saying that, because it's true. I'm not a leftist for saying, am I a leftist because I say the truth? I've been called left-wing for saying the truth, and I've been called right-wing for saying the truth. Maybe the truth is neither right nor left. Maybe the truth is just simply not something that can be taken over by Orwellian mind control. The Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, and the Muskogee were ideal Southerners. They were far more invested into the Southern way of life than a lot of Germans and Irish and even Scots were. Okay, and even some Southern Unionists were. And Southern Israelite and Code of Cletus don't consider those people to be Southerners. They hate them. They hate their guts. They don't think that the Cherokee are Southerners. So that right there should tell you how much of a shortcoming both liberalism and conservatism actually is. It is all a grand lie. It is a grand, nonsensical, irrational lie, and it's a lie that came out of the Enlightenment. And a lot of good and wonderful things came out of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment did a lot of good things. It got rid of religious fanaticism. It helped to stop religious, barbarous fanaticism in Europe between Catholics and Protestants. But it also led to a lot of bad ideas too. Napoleonic France and the United States were expansionist countries. They were imperialist countries, and the idea, or like some kind of special magic idea, that the early United States was somehow free from the mentality of colonialism and empire is a lie. It's a farce. It's exactly what it is. It's a farce. We have not even gone to the Civil War. Okay? Southern nationalists will say that this all started with the Civil War. No, not at all. It started well before the Civil War, and it started with the Revolution. All these problems that we have with the Federal Reserve, with the money budget, all have their origins 250 years ago in the Revolution. They all go back to the Revolution. They go back to the founding of America and the way that America was founded from the very beginning. It goes back to the very beginning. Alright, so I'll read chat. Let's see here. Willie McDuff says that I am good Imperator. Hope you are as well. Milk Cow says, how goes it Warhammer? Milk Cow says, what's your thoughts on the Founding Fathers being primarily Anglican and atheistic? I don't think that you really understand what an Anglican is and what an atheist is. You seem to have this mindset that because these things sound alike, they must be the same thing. An Anglican is a person who is a member of the Church of England and follows and takes Anglican rites. An atheist is a person who does not believe that there is a deity. They don't believe in a prescribed deity or in a prescribed deistic mindset. They're not theists. Atheism just means to be anti-theism. Milk Cow says that this is represented by the architecture, like the Lincoln Memorial and the Capitol. Lincoln was a free thinker, but this period, Milk Cow, this covers the period from 1760 to 1845. So this is in a time period that is after the scope of this documentary, so your answer will not be addressed and will not be answered. It goes beyond the scope of the point of this video. Please read the title of the video. It says Beginnings, 1760 to 1845, American Foreign Policy. This has nothing to do with Abraham Lincoln. Your question is not going to be answered. Okay, don't throw these irrelevant, indifferent questions towards me. Stick to the point. Let's see here. Milk Cow says, very much Roman influenced. Milk Cow says, old America hated the papacy. Yeah, that is actually very true, Milk Cow. The Americans back in the day really did not like Roman Catholics. There was a very anti-papist agenda that was being pushed. Roach Inc. says Rick was right. Are you talking about Rick Perry? Roach? Milk Cow says, rest in peace, Pope Francis. Yeah. God rest his soul. Anyways, Milk Cow says the Republican Party is based on an anti-communist 1950s McCarthy era ideology. Again, this period in question goes from 1760 to 1845. You're talking about a period that goes beyond the scope of this of the message being addressed here. Your answer will not be addressed, Milk Cow. Milk Cow says, I am all for the separation of church and state, with Christ abhorred. But it seems like the lines are blurred anymore. The lines are blurred anymore. The intention was to not have religion predominate in terms of an idea of the ideology that drove the state. But that's exactly what happened. Protestantism has always had a very strong influence on the domestic mindset, at least until quite recently. Christ supported the separation of church and state. Sorry, ambiguous phrasing. That's okay, yeah. I don't think that religion should be taught in at least public schools. I think the state and the church should very much be separated, but they should work together and cooperate and do things in cooperation. There's a purpose for each institution, and institutions need to work together in order to keep society ongoing. If institutions fight each other, especially long-standing and high-trusted institutions, then that's when you know that there is about to be a collapse of the society. Milk Cow says that Yu Yu Hakusho or Dragon Ball Z. That has nothing to do with the topic being discussed. Code of Truth says that America's based. I mean, in some regards, I guess. I posted that I don't hate Canadians. I just think that such a large country shouldn't be ruled by a small island country. I don't even know why I said that. Canadians are just very different from Americans. But anyways, here's some stuff for Code of Truth. What was the position of Roman Catholics in the American Revolution?
The position of Roman Catholics in the American Revolution was complex and marked by a fascinating shift. Here's a breakdown. Initial mistrust and anti-Catholic sentiment. Historical prejudice. For a long time, English Protestants in the colonies harbored deep-seated anti-Catholic sentiments, viewing Catholicism as a threat to liberty and associating it with tyranny. This prejudice was brought over from Europe and actively cultivated in the colonies. The Quebec Act, the British Parliament's passage of the Quebec Act in 1774, was a major point of contention. This act granted religious freedom to Catholics in Quebec and extended the province's boundaries. Many American colonists viewed this as one of the intolerable acts, fearing a British alliance with the Popish powers and the imposition of Catholicism. No popery became a rallying cry for some revolutionaries, shifting allegiances, and patriot support. Desire for greater liberty. Despite facing discrimination in 12 of the 13 colonies, the majority of Catholics in America ultimately sided with the patriot cause. They saw the revolution as an opportunity to gain greater religious freedom and civil liberties for themselves. Strategic alliances. The alliance with Catholic France in 1778 was a turning point. The presence of French troops and naval power, along with their Catholic chaplains, fostered a greater degree of tolerance and mutual respect between Catholics and Protestants in the colonies. Public displays of anti-Catholicism became unthinkable due to this crucial alliance. Catholic contributions to the patriot cause. Catholics actively participated in the revolution in various ways. Military service. Many Catholics enlisted in the Continental Army and Navy, fighting alongside their Protestant compatriots for independence. Leadership. Notable figures like Charles Carroll of Carrollton, the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence, John Barry, often called the father of the American Navy, and Stephen Moylan, Washington's Muster-Master General, provided significant leadership and support. Financial and material support. Catholics contributed financially and helped gather essential supplies for the war effort. Clerical support. Father John Carroll, later the first Catholic bishop in the United States, ministered to Catholic soldiers and even accompanied a delegation to Canada to seek their alliance or neutrality. Father Pierre Gibault played a crucial role in securing the Northwest Territory for the Americans. Foreign volunteers. Many foreign officers who were instrumental in the American victory, such as the Marquis de Lafayette, Tadeusz Kosciuszko, and Casimir Pulaski, were Catholic. Post-revolution. Increased tolerance. The shared struggle for independence and the contributions of Catholics helped to diminish some of the pre-war anti-Catholic prejudice. Continued challenges. Despite the progress, Catholics still faced some degree of discrimination and were sometimes considered second-class citizens in the new nation. Some state constitutions continued to restrict their participation in public life. Seeds of religious freedom, the revolution, and the ideals it espoused laid the groundwork for greater religious tolerance in the United States. Catholics like John Carroll actively advocated for religious freedom and the separation of church and state. In conclusion, while initially viewed with suspicion and subject to significant prejudice, Roman Catholics largely embraced the patriot cause during the American Revolution. Their active participation, leadership, and the crucial alliance with Catholic France contributed significantly to the American victory and helped pave the way for greater religious tolerance in the new nation.
Code of Truth says that America's based. What role did Roman Catholics play in the Texas Revolution? Hold on a second. What role did Roman Catholics play in the Texas Revolution?
The role of Roman Catholics in the Texas Revolution is multifaceted and intertwined with the socio-political landscape of the time. Here's a breakdown. Background. Official religion. Under both Spanish and initially Mexican rule, Roman Catholicism was the official religion in Texas. This meant that while the government encouraged immigration, it also stipulated that newcomers should embrace Catholicism. Limited clergy. By the time of the Texas Revolution, there was a scarcity of Catholic priests serving the vast territory of Texas. This led to a degree of religious self-reliance among the Tejano, Mexican Texan population. Anglo-American immigration. The Mexican government encouraged Anglo-American settlement in Texas to bolster the population and economy. While these settlers were expected to become Catholic, many were Protestant and often disregarded this requirement. This created religious tensions. During the Revolution, diverse loyalties. The Catholic population in Texas, primarily the Tejanos, held diverse views on the Revolution. Some actively supported the Texan cause, while others remained loyal to Mexico or tried to stay neutral. Friction with Protestant settlers. The requirement to be Catholic created friction with the predominantly Protestant Anglo-American settlers, who often desired religious freedom. This was one of the grievances that contributed to the Revolution. Impact on Catholic communities. The Revolution itself had a disruptive impact on Mexican Catholic communities in Texas. Churches were damaged or expropriated, and the presence of clergy was reduced in some areas. After the Revolution, religious freedom. The Republic of Texas established religious freedom, which led to the growth of Protestant denominations in the region. Reorganization of the Catholic Church. Following Texas independence, the Vatican recognized the new republic and established a separate ecclesiastical jurisdiction in 1840. This led to a reorganization and expansion of the Catholic Church in Texas, with increased numbers of European Catholic immigrants also arriving. Anti-Catholic sentiment. Despite the establishment of religious freedom, anti-Catholic sentiment persisted among some Anglo-Protestants in the Republic of Texas. In summary, while Roman Catholicism was the established religion before the Revolution, the Revolution itself was partly fueled by the desire for religious freedom by Protestant settlers. Tejanos, who were largely Catholic, had varied responses to the conflict. The aftermath of the Revolution brought religious freedom to Texas and a reorganization of the Catholic Church to adapt to the new political landscape.
All right. Did that answer your question, Code of Truth? Here. Differences between Anglicans and atheists.
Atheism and Anglicanism represent fundamentally different worldviews, primarily in their stance on the existence of God and the nature of reality. Here's a breakdown of the key differences. Anglicanism, belief in God. Anglicans are Christians, and therefore believe in one God who exists as a Trinity: Father, Son, Jesus Christ, and Holy Spirit. They believe God is the creator and sustainer of the universe. Belief in Jesus Christ. Anglicans believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, fully human and fully divine, who came to earth, died, and rose again to save humanity from sin and death. He is central to their faith and worship. The Holy Spirit. Anglicans believe in the Holy Spirit as the third person of the Trinity, who empowers believers and guides the Church. The Bible. Anglicans consider the Bible to be the inspired Word of God and the ultimate authority on matters of faith and salvation. Sacraments. Anglicans recognize two central sacraments instituted by Christ, baptism and Holy Communion, also known as the Eucharist. They believe these are outward signs of inward grace. The Church. Anglicans believe in the Church as the body of Christ on earth, a community of...
All right, so I hope that answered your question about Anglicans and atheists. No, most of the founding fathers were religious people. They were Christian, but some of them were deists, which is kind of a very early form of 18th century British agnosticism, or just indifference of religion. And two-second mapper posts a question mark. Anyways, I've been your host, Imperator of ForgeWarHammer. This has been my review of American Foreign Policy, Number 1, Beginnings, 1760 to 1845 by Praise of Folly. Oh yeah, Milk Cow asked about the Republican Party. The Republican Party was founded in Illinois in 1854. It was a combination of a bunch of ex-Whigs and Jeffersonians and Jacksonian Democrats and Whigs, and they eventually got around a platform of free soil, abolitionism, and know-nothings. That's the actual origins of the Republican Party. Anyways, I've been your host, Imperator of Forge. Thank you for watching. Forge Gang! I am still a heart!